Trent Clapperton received the invitation on a Tuesday afternoon, which seemed to him an unnecessarily ordinary day for a thing that would later divide his life into before and after. At the time, he was sitting in his office above the loading docks of Prairie Meridian Components, a mid-sized manufacturer of agricultural machinery parts on the edge of Winnipeg, watching snow blow sideways across the yard while a forklift driver named Benny tried, with heroic optimism and questionable steering technique, to reverse a pallet of hydraulic housings into Bay 3 without removing the corner of the building. Trent had spent 31 years in finance and operations, which meant he had developed the peculiar ability to see the world not as events but as systems under strain. A late supplier shipment was never just a late supplier shipment. It was overtime in assembly, expedited freight, annoyed customers, exhausted supervisors, margin leakage, and eventually a sales manager standing in his doorway explaining that customer relationships were more important than gross profit, which was the sort of sentence people only said when they were about to lose money. At 54, Trent was not cynical exactly, but he had become intimate with the small dishonesties of modern business. The forecasts everyone knew were fictional, the emergency meetings that solved nothing, the software dashboards that glowed confidently while the actual plant floor waited for a 27-cent gasket from Ohio. He believed in civilization, broadly speaking, but he had also reviewed enough inventory reports to know that civilization often depended on somebody remembering to reorder the right bearing before Friday. The envelope arrived by courier just after lunch, thick cream paper in a world of PDF attachments, with Trent's name handwritten in blue ink by someone who had either gone to boarding school or spent too much time pretending they had. There was no company logo, no return address, and no hint of urgency except for the fact that nobody sent physical invitations anymore unless they were getting married, suing you politely, or trying to sell you a timeshare in a mountain resort with maintenance fees large enough to require their own line of credit. Trent opened it with the little letter opener his daughter had given him years earlier as a joke after he complained that modern offices had taken away all the pleasant rituals and left only password resets. Inside was a single folded sheet, a topographic map printed on heavy paper, and a railway ticket from Winnipeg to Jasper, dated for the following Friday. The note contained only one sentence beneath a name he had not seen in nearly 20 years. "We are not preparing for the end of the world, Trent. We are preparing for the interruption." It was signed, in the same blue ink, Eleanor Vale. For a long time, Trent simply stared at the note while the office continued around him in its usual democratic confusion of ringing phones, distant compressor noise, printer jams, and someone laughing too loudly near the coffee machine. Eleanor Vale had been a structural engineer when he knew her, though calling Eleanor merely an engineer was like calling a cathedral a roof. She had possessed the alarming quality of understanding things before other people understood the question, and she could make a room of confident men become quieter simply by drawing a rectangle on a whiteboard and asking what was supposed to hold it up. They had met in university, back when Trent still believed accounting was a noble language for describing reality rather than a defensive weapon used by middle managers during budget season. Eleanor had gone west after graduation, then north, then somehow out of ordinary circulation altogether. Every few years, Trent had heard rumors. She was working on remote infrastructure. She was consulting for hydro projects. She was designing modular housing for places where winter arrived like an invading army. Then nothing. People like Eleanor did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they found something more interesting than being known. By 5 o'clock, Trent had convinced himself that the invitation was either a prank, a recruitment scheme, or the opening move in one of those elaborate private sector resilience initiatives funded by billionaires who had recently discovered that money did not make them less mortal. By 6:30, after the plant had emptied and the lights in the yard came on blue-white against the snow, he was still sitting at his desk with the map spread beneath his hands. The location marked by a small black circle lay beyond Jasper, past roads that became thinner and less persuasive as they moved into the mountains, in a valley with no town name and no obvious reason to visit unless you were a goat, a surveyor, or a person trying to avoid being found. The sensible part of Trent's mind, which had paid mortgages, raised children, negotiated credit facilities, and survived 3 ERP implementations, told him to place the envelope in a drawer and go home. The other part, the older and more dangerous part, remembered Eleanor Vale standing in the university engineering building at midnight, hair tied back with a pencil, telling him that most people mistook convenience for strength. He folded the map carefully, placed it back in the envelope, shut down his computer, and realized with some irritation that he had already decided to go. The train west carried him through the long, flat winter dark of the prairies, where farmyards appeared and vanished like small constellations, and grain elevators stood against the horizon with the solemn posture of old priests. Trent had always liked trains because they made distance feel earned. Airplanes lifted you out of geography and dropped you elsewhere with no sense of consequence, but trains reminded you that the world was joined together by steel, fuel, schedules, weather, maintenance crews, switches, bridges, and the trust of strangers. He sat by the window with a coffee that tasted faintly of cardboard and watched the country unroll past him in frozen layers, thinking about all the invisible dependencies that made even this simple journey possible. Somewhere, a dispatcher understood where they were. Somewhere, crews had inspected track. Somewhere, diesel had been refined, transported, taxed, purchased, pumped, and burned. Somewhere, someone had manufactured the window seal beside his shoulder, and someone else had kept the pension fund solvent enough to maintain the railway's obligations, or at least solvent enough to pretend convincingly. Civilization, Trent thought, was not a monument. It was a relay race conducted in bad weather by people who were usually tired. Eleanor was waiting for him in Jasper beside an old green Land Cruiser with a cracked windshield and tires that suggested she had little patience for paved roads. She was older, of course, as he was, but not diminished. Her hair had gone silver and was cut short now, and her face had acquired the calm, weathered authority of someone who had spent years arguing with mountains and occasionally winning. She greeted him not with nostalgia, but with a practical hug, as if he had arrived slightly late for a shift. "You look like a man who has spent 3 decades asking why the numbers don't match," she said, taking his bag before he could object. "You look like a woman who has spent 3 decades making sure the bridge doesn't fall down," Trent replied, and she smiled in a way that made him suddenly and unexpectedly happy. They drove for nearly 4 hours, first along roads that tourists used, then along roads that logging trucks used, and finally along roads that seemed to exist only because someone stubborn had once believed in them. Eleanor did not explain much at first. She asked about his work, his children, his knees, his blood pressure, his opinion of modern procurement software, and whether he still believed depreciation was a moral failing disguised as an accounting estimate. Trent answered as best he could while the mountains rose around them, immense and blue and indifferent, their slopes furred with black spruce and snow. As the road narrowed, the conversation became quieter, not because they had run out of things to say, but because the place itself seemed to ask for silence. Late in the afternoon, after passing through a gate hidden between 2 stands of pine, they descended into a valley Trent had not seen on any road map, and there, below them, where he expected perhaps a research station or a private lodge, he saw a settlement. It did not look like the end of the world. That was the first thing he noticed. There were no concrete blast doors, no watchtowers, no men in camouflage holding rifles with the theatrical seriousness of people who badly wanted a crisis to justify their hobbies. Instead, the valley held a small working town arranged with a level of intention that made Trent lean forward in his seat. Terraced greenhouses stepped down a south-facing slope, their glass roofs catching the last weak light of the winter sun. A narrow river ran through the valley, partly frozen at the edges, feeding a low hydro station built from stone, steel, and what looked like stubbornness. Beyond it stood workshops with high windows, barns painted deep red, a sawmill, a row of insulated houses, a school with children's drawings taped inside the windows, and, near the center, a large timber building whose wide doors were open to reveal shelves, endless shelves filled with books. Smoke rose from chimneys. A bell rang somewhere. 2 teenagers pushed a cart loaded with split firewood, while an elderly woman in a blue parka directed them with the severity of a conductor leading an orchestra. Near a long greenhouse, 3 people were repairing a pump under a temporary canvas shelter, their tools laid out neatly on a blanket. It was not a bunker. It was a community. Eleanor stopped the vehicle at an overlook and let him stare. She seemed to understand that explanations offered too soon would only cheapen the moment. Trent stepped out into the cold and listened. Beneath the wind, he heard water moving through the hydro intake, the faint whine of a saw, the clank of metal from a shop, a dog barking once and then deciding against further comment, and somewhere, impossibly, someone practicing a trumpet with more enthusiasm than skill. The sound made him laugh before he realized why. It was absurd, that trumpet, and therefore it was civilization. Nobody trying merely to survive would tolerate a beginner trumpet player at supper hour. Only people planning to live would make room for that. "We call it Haven Valley officially," Eleanor said. "Unofficially, people call it the Quiet Ark." Trent looked at her. "How many?" 412 permanent residents, another 180 seasonal, rotating through training, research, medical placements, apprenticeships, and what we politely call useful tourism. Useful tourism? People who pay us to learn how bad they are at practical things. That sounds profitable. Not especially, but it is educational for everyone else. They began the descent into the valley, and with every turn in the road, Trent noticed details that unsettled him more than any fortress could have. The settlement had been designed by people who had thought about maintenance. Roof pitches were steep enough for snow load. Buildings were close enough to reduce heat loss and travel time, but not so close that one fire would eat the whole town. Wood piles were covered properly. Paths were graded for drainage. The hydro station had backup lines. The greenhouses had thermal mass walls built from dark stone. Nothing looked luxurious, but nothing looked improvised either. Trent saw a small clinic, a bakery, a textile room through steamed windows, a mechanical shop where a man in coveralls was explaining something to a group of children gathered around a disassembled pump. He saw a notice board covered with schedules, repair requests, music lessons, seed rotation charts, and a handwritten reminder that anyone borrowing the community torque wrench without signing it out would lose dessert privileges for 1 week. That, more than anything, convinced him Eleanor was telling the truth. In fake utopias, everyone spoke in slogans. In real communities, people argued about tools. They parked outside the large timber building at the center of the settlement. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, paper, wool, coffee, and soup. The main hall was part library, part dining room, part civic square, with long tables arranged beneath beams heavy enough to outlast several administrative theories. People looked up as Eleanor entered, not with suspicion, but with recognition, and several greeted Trent by name though he had never met them, which made him feel briefly like a guest at his own surprise audit. Eleanor introduced him to a doctor who had once run emergency medicine in Calgary, a machinist from Sudbury, a seed biologist from Saskatchewan, a former school principal from Halifax, a carpenter from Prince George, a brewer from nowhere in particular, and a woman named Amara Singh who ran logistics with the amused calm of someone who could probably invade a small country using only spreadsheets and polite emails. They did not seem like survivalists. They seemed like the people who kept things working while louder people gave interviews. Supper was served without ceremony. Lentil stew, fresh bread, roasted carrots, pickled beets, butter, apple preserves, and a dark beer brewed on site that Trent privately considered better than several commercial products with larger marketing budgets and worse discipline. He sat between Eleanor and Amara while the room filled with conversation. Nobody asked him whether he believed society was doomed. Nobody spoke of collapse with relish. They talked about ordinary things: a bearing failure at the mill, a calf born early, a teenager accepted into an external engineering program, the greenhouse humidity controls, a debate over whether the school choir was ready to perform in public or merely ready to test the community's commitment to compassion. The normality was so complete that Trent began to feel that he, not they, had been living in the strange place. Only after supper did Eleanor take him to the archive room beneath the library. They descended a set of stone stairs into a space that was cool, dry, and larger than he expected. Rows of compact shelving held books, manuals, maps, medical references, engineering drawings, agricultural records, chemistry texts, machine schematics, seed catalogs, legal documents, financial ledgers, and binders labeled with a specificity that made Trent's accountant heart stir despite itself. There were instructions for making soap, paper, glass, insulin, nails, cheese, vaccines, bearings, bricks, ink, and musical instruments. There were oral histories recorded on redundant media. There were printed copies of thousands of technical papers organized not by academic prestige, but by usefulness. There were mechanical calculators, drafting tools, microscopes, hand looms, radios, printing plates, veterinary guides, and a small shelf labeled "Mistakes Worth Remembering." Trent paused there. "Good title," he said. Eleanor nodded. "Most important shelf in the room." At the far end of the archive, she unlocked a cabinet and removed a thick binder. On its cover was printed a title in plain black letters: Continuity Ledger. version 12.4. She handed it to Trent as though it weighed more than paper. Inside were inventories, production capacities, energy budgets, crop yields, maintenance intervals, tool life estimates, skill matrices, medical stock rotations, apprenticeship pipelines, water system redundancies, and economic models showing how the valley could function under different levels of isolation. Trent turned page after page, his professional skepticism giving way to something more complicated. It was not perfect. He could see assumptions that needed testing, constraints that worried him, optimistic labor allocations, medical vulnerabilities, machine dependencies, and the eternal accounting problem of spare parts. But it was serious. More than serious, it was humble. It did not claim that courage would solve logistics or that good intentions would replace inventory discipline. It admitted that people needed calories, heat, antibiotics, stories, replacement belts, winter boots, trained midwives, and someone willing to clean the composting system when idealism had gone to bed. "Why am I here?" he asked at last. Eleanor leaned against the table and folded her arms. "Because we built a place that can grow food, generate power, machine parts, teach children, print books, treat illness, and survive several years without outside supply under controlled conditions. That sounds like a success." "It is," she said. "Technically." Trent looked up. "That is an ominous use of the word technically. We can make things work. We can fix pumps, grow wheat, repair turbines, teach algebra, deliver babies, preserve seeds, and put on a tolerable spring concert. But our economics are still too fragile. We track inventory well, but not beautifully. We understand production, but not opportunity cost deeply enough. People still think of money as either unnecessary or corrupting, which is charming until two departments both need copper pipe. We need someone who understands that accounting is not just about profit. It is about truth under constraint." Trent laughed softly, though he was not sure it was funny. "You brought me across 3 provinces because your utopia needs a controller?" "No," Eleanor said. "I brought you here because our ark needs a conscience with a calculator." He looked down at the continuity ledger again, at the columns of numbers that represented bread, heat, medicine, time, and trust. He thought of Prairie Meridian components, of Benny and the forklift, of missing gaskets and fictional forecasts, of all the businesses pretending efficiency was the same as resilience. He thought of his daughter, who had once asked him why adults always seemed surprised when systems failed after being neglected for years. He thought of the trumpet player somewhere above them, practicing badly in a warm room because someone had built a place where bad trumpet practice still mattered. That night, in the guest room above the library, Trent lay awake beneath a wool blanket while the valley settled into winter silence around him. Outside his small window, lamps glowed along the paths, and beyond them, the mountains stood black against a sky crowded with stars. He had expected, if he came at all, to find eccentricity, paranoia, or rich people playing pioneer behind expensive gates. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous to his peace of mind: competence joined to hope. It would have been easier to dismiss if they were fanatics. It would have been easier if Eleanor had spoken of doom with shining eyes. But nobody here seemed eager for civilization to fail. They had built the quiet ark not because they hated the world, but because they loved it enough to make a backup copy. Just before sleep took him, Trent remembered the sentence from the invitation: "Not the end of the world, the interruption." In his old life, interruptions were late trucks, software outages, snowstorms, supplier bankruptcies, labor shortages, and emails marked urgent by people with no authority over reality. But here, the word felt larger and quieter. It suggested that the future might not arrive as fire or thunder. It might arrive as a series of delays, shortages, breakdowns, and apologies. A medicine unavailable for 6 weeks, a transformer no longer manufactured, a crop failure in one region and a port strike in another, a payment system offline, a fuel shipment missed, a school unable to hire teachers, a hospital waiting for parts, a civilization not destroyed exactly, but paused long enough for everyone to discover what they had forgotten how to do. In the morning, Eleanor would show him the farms, then the powerhouse, then the machine shops, then the clinic, the school, the archive, the bakery, the loom room, the council hall, and the little brewery that seemed, from what Trent had tasted, to be among the valley's strongest arguments for survival. In the morning, he would begin asking impolite questions about labor allocation, depreciation, spare parts, crop yield variance, and whether anyone had considered the emotional cost of assigning value to things people considered sacred. But for now, he closed his eyes and listened to the river moving under ice, steady and patient, carrying power through the dark. When I woke the next morning, the valley was still wrapped in the peculiar blue silence that belongs only to mountain winters before sunrise, when even smoke rising from chimneys seems reluctant to disturb the air. For a few moments I forgot where I was. The room was simple but beautifully made, with smooth pine walls, a heavy quilt stitched from dozens of different fabrics, a bookshelf holding practical titles like Hydraulic Systems Maintenance, Field Botany of Western Canada, and, somewhat reassuringly, 3 detective novels whose pages had clearly been turned many times. Through the frost at the edges of the window, I could see the eastern ridgeline beginning to glow, and below it, the lights of Haven Valley were already scattered across the snow like warm embers. The town had been awake long before I was. Somewhere outside, I heard the steady rumble of a diesel tractor starting, followed by the softer clatter of boots crossing wooden walkways. Then came the smell. Fresh bread. I smiled despite myself. Every civilization, I reflected while pulling on my sweater, announces its priorities somehow. Some announce themselves with church bells, others with stock exchanges or military parades. The quiet ark announced itself with bread. Breakfast was served in the great hall where I had eaten supper the previous evening, although served was hardly the correct word. Nearly everyone participated. Teenagers carried trays from the kitchen while retirees poured coffee. Someone tuned a fiddle in the corner. A young mother bounced a sleepy toddler on her knee while discussing irrigation pumps with an elderly man whose beard suggested he had been born already looking wise. There was laughter, conversation, and none of the strained politeness I had expected from a community built around preparedness. They behaved less like survivalists than members of a large extended family who had simply accepted that everyone occasionally had to wash dishes. The bread itself deserved its own chapter. Thick slices of still warm sourdough emerged from wicker baskets, accompanied by butter churned the day before, raspberry preserves made from last summer's harvest, eggs collected that morning, smoked trout from the valley reservoir, and oatmeal topped with dried apples and roasted hazelnuts. I found myself eating far more than I intended, partly because everything tasted exceptional, and partly because no one seemed embarrassed to enjoy food. Modern life often encouraged guilt with every indulgence. Here, nourishment was celebrated as one of civilization's great achievements. Across the table sat a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s, introducing herself as Margaret Olson, though everyone called her Maggie. She shook my hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to lifting 50-pound sacks of flour before breakfast. "I'm told you're our new numbers fellow," she said cheerfully. "That sounds dangerously close to being called an accountant," I replied. "Well," she laughed, "around here that's practically a compliment." Eleanor appeared carrying 2 mugs of coffee and slid into the empty chair beside me. "Maggie runs the bakery," she explained. "Among other things." Maggie shrugged modestly. "Everyone runs several things around here. If your entire civilization depends on specialization, you eventually discover that vacations become complicated." I laughed, but I noticed she wasn't joking. After breakfast, Maggie invited me to tour the bakery before beginning what Eleanor referred to as my orientation, a word that suggested PowerPoint presentations and laminated safety manuals rather than fresh loaves emerging from stone ovens. The bakery stood beside the main square, built from thick timber beams and local stone. Warm air rushed over us as we entered, carrying the rich scent of yeast, flour, wood smoke, and caramelized crusts that instantly reminded me of childhood Saturday mornings. Large windows admitted generous sunlight, while rows of polished wooden tables filled the center of the room. 4 brick ovens dominated one wall, each glowing softly beneath arched stonework that had obviously been crafted by someone who intended it to last generations. Workers moved with quiet efficiency, kneading dough, measuring ingredients, loading peels into ovens, rotating loaves, recording temperatures in neat, handwritten logbooks. Nothing felt hurried. Yet nothing stood idle either. The entire operation possessed a rhythm that modern factories often struggled to achieve despite spending millions on automation. I expected industrial mixers, I admitted, as Maggie led me between workstations. She grinned. We have them. She pointed toward two gleaming electric mixers tucked against the back wall. They're excellent. They save labor. They also require bearings, circuit boards, belts, motors, electricity, maintenance schedules, replacement parts, and eventually manufacturers who still exist. She rested a hand on one of the large wooden mixing troughs nearby. These don't. Her fingers tapped the worn oak affectionately. The trick isn't rejecting technology. It's refusing to become dependent on only one version of it. That sentence lingered in my mind as we continued through the building. Every process seemed duplicated in some thoughtful way. Electric mills stood beside traditional stone mills. Digital thermometers hung next to old-fashioned oven gauges. Computerized inventory records were backed up by handwritten ledgers stored in waterproof cabinets. Even the recipes existed in three forms: digital archives, printed binders, and handwritten notebooks copied every few years by apprentices learning not only baking but penmanship. I had spent decades in businesses obsessed with eliminating redundancy in the name of efficiency. Here, redundancy was considered a feature rather than a flaw. It felt almost wasteful until I remembered how many companies I had watched grind to a halt because one specialized component had failed to arrive on time. Maggie eventually led me into a storeroom where shelves rose almost to the ceiling, each labeled with elegant simplicity: flour, rye, oats, salt, honey, dried yeast cultures, spices, oils, vinegar, seeds, dried fruit. Everything was organized with remarkable discipline. Every container carried dates, quantities, rotation schedules, inspection records, and expected consumption rates. I couldn't resist examining one of the ledgers hanging from a clipboard. The handwriting was immaculate. Daily production, weekly averages, seasonal adjustments, waste percentages, moisture corrections, shelf life calculations. It looked suspiciously like something I would have designed myself. Maggie noticed my expression and smiled knowingly. Eleanor said you'd probably make that face. What face? The one accountants make when they discover someone else has alphabetized reality. I laughed harder than the joke probably deserved because she wasn't wrong. There is a peculiar satisfaction in seeing information treated with respect. Good records are not merely administrative exercises. They are accumulated memory. Every figure represented experience translated into knowledge. A poor wheat harvest 5 years earlier had adjusted planting schedules. A harsh winter had changed fuel allocations. Changes in humidity had influenced flour storage methods. Every mistake remained visible, so it would not need repeating. I thought about the archive Eleanor had shown me the previous evening, particularly the shelf labeled "Mistakes Worth Remembering." Increasingly, I suspected that shelf contained the true philosophy of Haven Valley. We climbed a narrow staircase overlooking the bakery floor where Maggie maintained a small office whose largest feature was not the desk, but an enormous wall chart spanning nearly 8 feet across. Colored strings connected diagrams of farms, grain storage, mills, bakeries, livestock, compost systems, greenhouses, schools, kitchens, and households. At first glance, it resembled one of those conspiracy boards detectives create in crime dramas. Maggie noticed my confusion. "That's bread," she said matter-of-factly. "Bread? The whole system." She walked toward the chart. "This starts with soil health over here. Soil determines grain quality. Grain quality affects milling yields. Milling affects flour storage. Flour storage affects baking schedules. Baking schedules affect labor shifts. Labor shifts affect childcare availability. Childcare affects education. Education affects apprenticeships. Apprenticeships affect future bakers. Future bakers determine whether people eat 20 years from now." She turned toward me with an amused smile. "Everything eventually connects to bread." Standing there, I experienced one of those quiet moments when an idea rearranges itself inside your mind. My career had conditioned me to analyze businesses through departments: purchasing, manufacturing, sales, finance, human resources, separate boxes connected by organizational charts. Maggie saw no departments. She saw relationships. Bread wasn't a product. It was a living network linking agriculture, engineering, education, logistics, energy, sanitation, transportation, family life, economics, and culture into one continuous system. Suddenly, I understood why Eleanor had invited me. Accounting itself wasn't about money. It was about relationships. Money merely happened to be one language for describing them. Before leaving, Maggie handed me a still warm loaf wrapped in linen. "Take this with you today," she said. "Why?" I asked. She winked. "Because people think better after they've broken bread together. We've tested the theory extensively." Outside, Eleanor waited beside a narrow path leading toward the terraced greenhouses climbing the southern slope above the valley. Snow crunched beneath our boots as we began walking. Farmers were already working among the glass structures despite the freezing air. Thin plumes of steam drifted from vents while sunlight reflected brilliantly from hundreds of window panes. "Food first," Eleanor said. "Everything else depends on it," I nodded, still holding Maggie's warm loaf beneath my arm. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "I came here expecting preparedness to be mostly about stockpiling supplies." Eleanor smiled without looking at me. "Most people do." We continued climbing until the entire valley spread beneath us like a carefully composed map. Workshops, homes, school, clinic, hydro station, library, barns, orchards sleeping beneath winter snow, all connected by winding paths and the river threading quietly through the center. It looked less like a settlement than a single living organism. Eleanor finally stopped near the first greenhouse and turned toward me. "Tell me honestly," she asked, "what do you think we're building?" I considered the question longer than she probably expected. Yesterday, I might have answered differently. I might have spoken about resilience, disaster planning, or sustainable communities. But after spending only a few hours inside the bakery, watching flour become bread through the coordinated efforts of dozens of skilled people, another answer seemed more truthful. "You're building continuity," I said quietly. "Not survival, continuity. You're trying to make sure that if the world stumbles, humanity doesn't have to start over." Eleanor's smile broadened into genuine satisfaction. "Exactly," she said. "Most people think civilization is made from skyscrapers, satellites, and stock markets. Those things are wonderful. But underneath them all, civilization is simply one generation teaching the next how to bake bread, repair pumps, grow food, heal illness, tell stories, solve problems, and care enough to pass the knowledge forward." She looked across Haven Valley, where morning sunlight now illuminated the rooftops one by one. "Everything else," she said softly, "is just architecture." As we stepped into the warmth of the first greenhouse, where rows of winter greens stretched toward the glass roof and the earthy scent of growing things replaced the sharp air outside, I found myself wondering how many places in the modern world still understood that simple truth. For the first time since arriving, I realized that the quiet arc wasn't preserving the past. It was preserving the possibility of the future. By the third morning, I had begun to notice something that seemed almost invisible during my first day in Haven Valley, yet once seen, it became impossible to ignore. Nobody here rushed. That did not mean people moved slowly. On the contrary, they worked with remarkable energy. The mechanic repairing a grain auger did not waste a single movement. The nurse crossing the square carried herself with quiet purpose. Children hurried to school with the boundless enthusiasm that belongs only to youth and dogs. What was missing was the peculiar panic I had grown accustomed to during 3 decades in modern business. Nobody sprinted from one crisis to another, clutching a coffee cup and apologizing for being late to a meeting that should never have existed in the first place. Nobody proudly announced they were completely swamped, as though exhaustion were a professional qualification. The valley seemed to operate according to a different rhythm entirely. Later I would learn that this was not accidental. It had been designed that way from the beginning. Eleanor often said that a civilization constantly operating at 100% capacity was not efficient. It was fragile, a little unused time, a little spare labor, a little extra inventory, a little redundancy. Those things appeared wasteful on spreadsheets, but invaluable in reality. I suspected accountants and engineers had been arguing over that truth for several thousand years. After breakfast, Eleanor met me outside the library carrying 2 heavy canvas jackets embroidered with a small blue emblem I had not noticed before. It depicted a river flowing beneath an open book. "The original founders designed that," she explained as she handed me one. Knowledge and water. They believed every successful civilization begins with both. I slipped the jacket on, appreciating its surprising warmth. Today, she said, we're visiting the river. I looked past her toward the broad ribbon of water winding through the valley. I saw the hydro station yesterday. Eleanor smiled. You saw the building. Today you're going to meet the system. We followed a trail downstream where the river narrowed into a rocky channel before disappearing between two granite cliffs. The sound reached us long before the water itself. At first it was merely a distant murmur beneath the wind, but gradually it became a deep, steady voice filling the valley with a kind of patient confidence. I had visited hydroelectric facilities before as part of various manufacturing audits, but they had always been enormous places, concrete monuments humming with transformers and switch yards engineered to power entire cities. What emerged around the bend surprised me. Haven Valley's hydro station looked almost modest. Stone retaining walls blended naturally into the landscape. Timber walkways crossed carefully engineered spill channels. The powerhouse itself resembled an oversized mountain lodge more than an industrial facility. Only the thick steel penstock descending toward the turbine hall hinted at the amount of energy flowing quietly beneath our feet. A tall man in grease-stained coveralls emerged from the building, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered any hope of becoming clean again. He possessed the weathered face of someone who spent more time outdoors than indoors, and the cheerful expression of a man who genuinely enjoyed solving mechanical problems. "Trent," Eleanor said, "I'd like you to meet Noah Garrison." Noah's handshake was firm enough to reassure me he could probably lift one end of the turbine if circumstances became sufficiently inconvenient. "Welcome to the only place in town where everyone suddenly becomes interested in engineering every time the lights flicker," he laughed. "Funny how that works." "I'm more familiar with balance sheets than turbines," I admitted. "Don't worry," Noah replied. "They have more in common than you'd think. Both become very exciting when they stop working." Inside the powerhouse, warmth enveloped us immediately. The air smelled faintly of lubricating oil, warm metal, cedar, and ozone. Beneath the floor, I could hear the low, rhythmic hum of generators converting falling water into electricity with a confidence that felt almost comforting. Noah led us along graded walkways overlooking the turbine hall below. Massive shafts rotated steadily beneath protective housings, while control panels displayed voltages, frequencies, water flow, bearing temperatures, and dozens of measurements I only partially understood. Everything gleamed from meticulous maintenance rather than newness. This machinery had clearly been operating for years, perhaps decades, yet every bolt appeared inspected, every surface cleaned, every gauge carefully calibrated. I found myself admiring the discipline more than the technology itself. "We could have bought newer equipment," Noah said, noticing my curiosity. "More efficient, more computerized, better marketing brochures." He leaned against the railing. "Instead, we chose equipment that 3 generations of mechanics could understand." He tapped the handrail thoughtfully. "That's one of our guiding principles. Complexity is wonderful until it becomes dependency." I nodded slowly. "In manufacturing, we always chased the latest technology." Noah smiled. "So do we. We simply ask a second question afterward. Which is, can we repair it ourselves 20 years from now if nobody answers the phone?" That sentence lingered uncomfortably in my mind because I realized how rarely anyone in my previous career had asked it. Noah spent the next hour walking me through the entire system with the patient enthusiasm of someone delighted to discover another willing student. The river fed a small reservoir several kilometers upstream, not because large dams were desirable, but because modest storage provided flexibility during seasonal fluctuations. Water entered the penstock through manually operable intake gates requiring no electricity to function. The turbines themselves were deliberately oversized, allowing them to operate comfortably below maximum capacity most of the year, reducing wear and extending service life. Every critical component possessed at least one backup. Spare bearings rested in climate-controlled storage. Replacement seals were manufactured locally whenever possible. Even lubricants were carefully selected based partly on performance and partly on long-term availability. I realized I wasn't merely touring a power station. I was witnessing an entire philosophy translated into engineering. At one point, Noah stopped beside an older generator disconnected from the main system. It appeared immaculate despite its obvious age. Brass nameplates gleamed beneath fresh polish, while every valve carried neatly engraved identification tags. "Our museum?" I asked. He shook his head. "Our insurance policy." Seeing my puzzled expression, he continued, "That generator is 63 years old. It's less efficient than our primary units, noisier, and considerably heavier. It also has one remarkable advantage." He grinned. "Every single part inside it can be manufactured using equipment already available in Haven Valley." I walked slowly around the machine. Cast iron housing, steel shafts, bronze bushings, copper windings, nothing exotic, nothing dependent on international supply chains or proprietary electronics. Suddenly I appreciated why it remained carefully maintained rather than discarded. It represented continuity made visible. As we continued deeper into the facility, Noah opened a steel cabinet containing row after row of handwritten maintenance logs dating back more than 20 years. I instinctively reached toward one volume before catching myself. "Go ahead," he encouraged. The pages revealed meticulous records, daily inspections, bearing temperatures, vibration analyses, oil samples, seasonal water flows, unexpected failures, repair procedures. Every entry signed, dated, and occasionally annotated with observations that revealed as much about the people as the machinery. One note read simply, "Unusual vibration traced to squirrel nest inside ventilation duct. Squirrel relocated. Generator appreciative." Another stated, "Bearing replacement delayed 2 days due to community harvest. Lesson learned. Wheat waits for no engineer." I laughed aloud. Noah shrugged. "Future mechanics deserve honest records, including our mistakes." Those words carried me back to the archive beneath the library and its shelf labeled "Mistakes Worth Remembering." Increasingly, I understood that Haven Valley treated failure differently from the outside world. Modern organizations often buried mistakes beneath layers of embarrassment, legal caution, or public relations language. Here they documented failures almost affectionately, not because failure was celebrated, but because forgetting it seemed more dangerous than admitting it. Every cracked shaft, contaminated well, spoiled harvest, or design flaw became part of the community's accumulated wisdom. Civilization, I was beginning to suspect, advanced less through genius than through careful note-taking. Around midday, we climbed a narrow service trail following the penstock toward the upper reservoir. Snow crunched beneath our boots while sunlight filtered through towering spruce trees. The climb was steeper than I expected, and by the time we reached the intake structure, I had become uncomfortably aware that office work had not prepared my knees for mountain engineering. Noah pretended not to notice my heavy breathing, which I appreciated enormously. The reservoir itself appeared surprisingly small, more like a quiet alpine lake than a major infrastructure project. Thin ice covered the sheltered coves while open water reflected the surrounding peaks with startling clarity. "This little lake powers the whole town?" I asked. "It powers our priorities," Noah corrected gently. I frowned. "There's a difference?" "A very important one." He crouched beside the water's edge and picked up a flat stone. "Suppose we have a severe drought. Water levels fall. We can no longer generate enough electricity for everything. What happens?" "I imagine people complain." "They always complain," he chuckled. "But after that?" I considered the question. "Rationing?" "Exactly, but what gets power first?" "The hospital." He nodded. "What next?" I thought for another moment. "Water treatment?" "Correct." "Then food production?" "Very good." I continued working through the problem almost like balancing an income statement. Communications, heating, machine shops, schools, homes, entertainment. Noah smiled broadly. "See? Engineers and accountants really do speak the same language. We simply use different units." He tossed the stone across the water where it skipped 6 times before disappearing beneath the surface. Most people think resilience means having more resources. Sometimes it simply means knowing your priorities before the emergency begins. We ate lunch sitting on sun-warmed rocks overlooking the valley while sharing Maggie's bread, smoked cheese, apples from the previous autumn's harvest, and hot tea poured from a large thermos Eleanor had somehow remembered to pack. Looking down from that height, Haven Valley appeared almost impossibly peaceful. Thin columns of smoke drifted upward from chimneys. Children crossed the schoolyard in colorful winter coats. Tiny figures worked among the greenhouses. The hydro station blended so naturally into the landscape that from above it seemed less constructed than grown. "It almost feels too peaceful," I admitted quietly. Eleanor looked at me thoughtfully. "Does that bother you?" "A little." "Why?" I searched for the right words. "Because my entire career taught me that if something looks this calm, somebody is hiding a crisis." She laughed warmly. "That's because most organizations postpone maintenance until the crisis arrives." Noah nodded in agreement. "We schedule ours before lunch." For a while, we simply watched the valley below. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "People often misunderstand why this place exists. They assume we're predicting disaster." "Aren't you?" She shook her head. "No." "No? We're predicting reality." I waited. "Civilizations aren't usually destroyed in a single dramatic event," she continued. "They're interrupted. Supply chains become unreliable. Infrastructure ages. Skills disappear faster than they're replaced. Institutions become complicated enough that no one fully understands them anymore. Eventually, people discover they can still buy things, but no longer know how to make them." I found myself thinking about manufacturing back in Winnipeg. How many machinists had retired without apprentices? How many experienced maintenance technicians had quietly disappeared from payroll while software subscriptions multiplied? How many companies now possessed impressive data analytics but struggled to repair their own equipment without outside contractors? "It already happens," I said softly. "It always has," Eleanor replied. The walk back to town followed the river downstream. Along the way, we passed several teenagers working under the supervision of an elderly electrician replacing sections of buried conduit. Rather than simply completing the repair himself, the instructor repeatedly asked questions before allowing anyone to touch a tool. Why this cable? Why this depth? Why this insulation? One teenager answered incorrectly, prompting gentle discussion rather than criticism. Eventually, the group reached the correct conclusion together. I watched them for several minutes. "They're slower this way," I observed. "They're faster in 20 years, Eleanor answered. That single sentence struck me harder than almost anything I had heard since arriving. They are faster in 20 years, so much of modern business optimized for next quarter, next month, sometimes next week. Haven Valley optimized for people who had not yet become experts. Every repair doubled as a lesson. Every project trained future builders. Every experienced worker considered education part of the job itself. By late afternoon, we returned to the town square where children had gathered near the frozen pond, constructing an elaborate network of snow forts connected by tunnels. Nearby, several retirees watched from benches while debating whether the engineering met acceptable structural standards. One gray-haired gentleman finally stood, walked over, and politely informed the children that one wall required reinforcement before someone inevitably attempted something spectacularly unwise. The children accepted the advice without complaint and immediately began rebuilding. Noah laughed quietly. "Future engineers?" "Or future accountants," I suggested. "No," he replied with absolute confidence. "The accountants are the ones already calculating how much snow they're using." That evening, after supper, I found myself sitting alone in the library with the continuity ledger spread open once again before me. But this time I understood something I had missed on my first night. The columns of figures weren't really describing electricity, wheat, inventories, or machine parts. They were describing time. Every spare bearing represented months of future operation. Every apprentice represented decades of future knowledge. Every seed stored carefully today represented harvests years from now. Every maintenance schedule postponed failure into another generation. Every loaf of bread baked that morning allowed someone else to continue teaching, building, repairing, inventing, or simply living. I turned another page and noticed a handwritten quotation tucked into the margin, unsigned and written in faded ink that suggested one of the original founders had placed it there years before. "A river does not remember the names of those who built its first bridge. It remembers only that the crossing remains." I closed the ledger gently and sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of Haven Valley settling into another winter evening. Somewhere outside, I heard the steady hum of the hydro station sending electricity through the town just as it had yesterday and would tomorrow. It occurred to me then that power was never really the point. Continuity was. By the end of my first week in Haven Valley, I had developed a habit that would have embarrassed the version of me who still lived in Winnipeg. Every morning before breakfast, while the valley remained suspended between darkness and dawn, I would walk alone through the central square simply to watch the town wake up. It was not a large place, certainly nothing compared to the cities where I had spent most of my career, yet each day revealed another layer of quiet complexity that I had somehow overlooked before. Lights appeared one by one in the bakery, followed shortly afterward by the clinic, then the school kitchen, the machine shop, and finally, the greenhouse district, as the automated thermal curtains began retracting with a soft mechanical rustle. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, while the first wagons and utility carts rolled onto the streets carrying milk, vegetables, tools, lumber, or simply people heading toward another day's work. Nobody blew a whistle, no sirens announced shift changes. The town seemed to possess an internal rhythm, like breathing, and each resident instinctively knew when to inhale and when to exhale. Standing there in the cold with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee from Maggie's bakery, I often found myself wondering whether this was how communities had functioned for thousands of years before clocks became more important than seasons. That morning, Eleanor joined me beneath the large maple tree in the square carrying a clipboard that looked suspiciously heavy for someone merely taking a walk. "Today," she announced with the faint smile that usually meant she was about to rearrange another piece of my understanding, "we're going to visit the machine shops." I nodded eagerly. Although every part of Haven Valley fascinated me, I had been looking forward to this visit more than I cared to admit. During my years in manufacturing, I had always believed that machine shops occupied a curious position within civilization. Most people never thought about them. They noticed automobiles, hospitals, bridges, wind turbines, tractors, or elevators, but rarely considered the places where the components for those things were actually made. Machine shops were like the backstage crew in a theater production. If they did their jobs well, nobody applauded because nobody noticed they existed. But remove them, and the performance ended remarkably quickly. The industrial district occupied the northern edge of the valley where prevailing winds carried noise away from the residential areas. Even before we arrived, I could hear the unmistakable sounds drifting through the crisp morning air. The rhythmic whine of a lathe taking a finishing cut, the sharp metallic tapping of a milling machine, the deeper percussion of a power hammer somewhere farther back. None of it sounded frantic. Instead, the noises blended into a surprisingly harmonious rhythm that reminded me less of a factory than an orchestra tuning before a concert. As we stepped inside the largest workshop, warmth and familiar scents greeted us immediately. Cutting oil, fresh sawdust from the adjoining woodworking shop, warm steel, lubricants, welding fumes, and coffee. Always coffee. If civilization were ever summarized honestly, I suspected historians would conclude that its greatest achievements had been accomplished largely by people carrying mugs. The building itself was magnificent in its practicality. Heavy timber beams supported a high ceiling fitted with overhead cranes capable of lifting surprisingly large machinery. Sunlight poured through tall north-facing windows specifically designed to provide consistent illumination without excessive glare. Workbenches lined one wall, each arranged with an orderliness that bordered on artistic expression. Precision measuring tools occupied carefully labeled drawers. Hand tools rested in custom wooden holders shaped exactly to fit each wrench, chisel, caliper, or screwdriver. Large machines stood across the main floor. Manual lathes, milling machines, drill presses, grinders, hydraulic presses, sheet metal brakes, welding stations, and equipment I only vaguely recognized from plant tours decades earlier. Nothing appeared flashy. Most of the machines looked 20 or 30 years old, some even older, yet every painted surface gleamed, every lead screw carried fresh lubricant, and every machine emitted the contented sound of equipment maintained by people who respected it. A broad-shouldered man wearing safety glasses looked up from a milling machine as we approached. Gray streaked his beard, though his eyes possessed the bright curiosity of someone who still found mechanical puzzles genuinely entertaining. "Trent," Eleanor said, "meet Daniel Mercer." Daniel extended a firm handshake whose calluses suggested he solved more problems with his hands than with committee meetings. "I've been warned about accountants," he said gravely. They count everything. Only the important things, I replied. He nodded approvingly. Good answer. Around here we count time, steel, people, and occasionally bolts. Mostly because losing bolts becomes surprisingly expensive. Daniel wasted little time with introductions. Instead, he handed me a pair of safety glasses and motioned toward an elderly machinist carefully turning a steel shaft on a manual lathe. Watch George, he whispered. Don't interrupt. We stood quietly while the older man advanced the cutting tool with movements so smooth they seemed almost effortless. Fine curls of bright steel spiraled away from the workpiece before falling neatly into the chip tray below. Every few moments, George paused, measured the diameter with a micrometer, adjusted the tool by an amount too small for me to detect, and continued. After nearly 15 minutes, he switched off the machine, examined the finished shaft beneath the light, smiled almost imperceptibly, and finally noticed we had been standing behind him all along. Daniel gestured toward the completed part. What do you think it is? I examined it carefully. A drive shaft? George chuckled. It was. I looked up. It was? It failed yesterday. He handed me the original component, fractured cleanly near one bearing surface. The crack revealed years of microscopic fatigue hidden beneath the polished exterior. So you made another? George shook his head gently. No. Seeing my confusion, he continued. I made the next one. That distinction stayed with me. Not another. The next one. George explained that the replacement incorporated 3 subtle improvements based on everything they had learned since the original shaft had been manufactured 12 years earlier. A slightly different alloy, a revised oil groove, a tiny change in shoulder radius to reduce stress concentration. Individually, none of the improvements seemed revolutionary. Collectively, they might double the component's service life. We never replace things, George said quietly. We improve the conversation. As an accountant, I had spent years depreciating machinery according to established schedules. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Yet standing there beside George's lathe, I realized that depreciation described only financial value. Knowledge appreciated, every repair increased understanding, every failure became another lesson embedded inside the next design. Civilization advanced not because machines lasted forever, but because each generation quietly left better machines for the next. Daniel led us deeper into the workshop, where several apprentices clustered around a partially disassembled water pump mounted on a heavy wooden bench. Rather than repairing it himself, an instructor stood nearby asking questions. What caused the seal to fail? One apprentice suggested poor lubrication. Another blamed contamination. A third pointed toward slight shaft misalignment. Instead of declaring the correct answer, the instructor simply asked another question. What evidence supports each possibility? The discussion continued for nearly 20 minutes before anyone reached for a wrench. They could repair it twice as fast, I observed. Daniel nodded. They could. So why don't they? Because we're not fixing a pump. I smiled. We're educating mechanics. No. He grinned. We're educating teachers. That answer surprised me. Teachers? The apprentice repairing this pump today will probably instruct someone else in 15 years. The real product leaving this room isn't repaired equipment. He paused thoughtfully. It's competent people. Once again, I found myself silently revising assumptions accumulated over an entire career. Every business I had ever worked with measured productivity through units produced, hours billed, revenue generated, or costs reduced. Haven Valley measured productivity partly through knowledge transferred. Every experienced craftsperson seemed to regard mentoring not as an interruption, but as an essential part of their daily work. It undoubtedly reduced short-term efficiency. Yet the long-term return on investment appeared extraordinary. Daniel eventually stopped before a massive steel cabinet extending nearly the entire length of one wall. Opening the heavy doors revealed thousands of carefully labeled compartments containing bearings, gears, fasteners, springs, electrical connectors, seals, bushings, belts, pulleys, hydraulic fittings, and components whose purposes escaped me entirely. Our inventory? I asked. Our memory, Daniel corrected. He removed an ordinary-looking brass bushing from one drawer. This fits 6 different machines. Another drawer contained nearly identical bushings. "These fit 12. He smiled. "Standardization." I laughed. "Now you're speaking my language." He nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Every unnecessary variation increases complexity. Complexity increases inventory. Inventory requires storage. Storage requires buildings. Buildings require maintenance. Maintenance requires labor." He returned the bushing carefully. "Simplicity compounds." That sentence struck me with almost mathematical elegance. Simplicity compounds. Compound interest had always fascinated me because small improvements accumulated into astonishing results over time. Daniel described engineering the same way. Every simplified design reduced future maintenance. Every standardized component decreased inventory. Every interchangeable part multiplied resilience. None of the individual savings seemed dramatic. Together, they transformed the economics of an entire community. Late that morning, we crossed into the adjoining woodworking shop, where the atmosphere shifted immediately from steel to timber. The scent alone could have convinced someone they had entered another world. Fresh cedar, pine, maple, walnut, linseed oil, beeswax, and shavings covered the floor beneath rows of hand planes, chisels, cabinet saws, carving benches, and drying racks filled with lumber harvested from the surrounding forests. Here, too, old and new technologies lived comfortably together. Computer-guided equipment occupied one corner, while hand tools crafted a century earlier remained in daily use nearby. A woman named Sophia guided us through rows of partially completed furniture, window frames, musical instruments, and cabinetry. She explained that the woodworking shop built everything from dining tables to wheelbarrows, violins to beehives, school desks to coffins. "Coffins?" I asked quietly. She nodded without hesitation. "Every civilization eventually needs them." Her answer carried neither sadness nor discomfort, simply acceptance. Later, as we watched an apprentice carefully fitting wooden joints without a single nail or screw, Sophia added something that lingered with me for the rest of the afternoon. "We don't avoid talking about death here." "Why not?" "Because pretending people won't die eventually encourages them to build things that won't last." I considered that while watching the young apprentice patiently shave tiny curls from a tenon until it fit perfectly inside its matching mortise. How many modern products were designed assuming replacement rather than longevity? How many buildings? How many institutions? How many careers? Perhaps the quiet ark differed not because its residents expected catastrophe, but because they expected continuity. They assumed future generations deserved equipment worth repairing rather than discarding. Just before lunch, Daniel invited me into a small conference room overlooking the workshop floor. The room contained no polished executive furniture, only a large wooden table scarred by decades of use, several comfortable chairs, a whiteboard, and shelves overflowing with engineering manuals. Spread across the table lay detailed production schedules, inventory reports, maintenance forecasts, apprenticeship rotations, and budget summaries. "I thought you'd enjoy these," he said. Enjoy was an understatement. Within minutes, I recognized familiar accounting structures hidden beneath unfamiliar terminology: labor allocation, capacity planning, preventive maintenance budgets, inventory carrying costs, equipment depreciation, although Haven Valley calculated depreciation based not merely on age but also repairability, local manufacturability, and strategic importance. "This is brilliant," I murmured. Daniel smiled modestly. "It isn't finished. No system ever is." "Exactly." He leaned forward. "Which is why Eleanor invited you." I looked up from the spreadsheets. "I thought she wanted help balancing the books." Daniel laughed warmly. "The books balance." He tapped the papers gently. "We need someone who understands the difference between efficiency and resilience." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside the conference room window, apprentices continued learning beside experienced machinists. Sparks drifted lazily from a welding booth. Overhead, cranes moved steel beams with deliberate precision. Somewhere, someone laughed loudly enough to interrupt the steady music of machinery. Finally, I understood. The quiet ark wasn't trying to preserve machines, or buildings, or even knowledge. It was preserving competence. Machines eventually wore out, buildings aged, books deteriorated, but a skilled person who patiently taught another skilled person could extend civilization almost indefinitely. That evening, while writing notes in the small journal I had begun carrying since arriving in Haven Valley, I found myself summarizing the day in a single sentence. The true factory of civilization is not the machine shop, it is the apprenticeship. I closed the journal, looked out toward the warmly lit workshops across the snowy valley, and realized something that would have sounded absurd only a week earlier. For the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about retirement. I was thinking about what kind of knowledge was still worth spending the rest of my life helping to preserve. By the beginning of my second week in Haven Valley, I had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that nearly every assumption I had carried with me from the outside world was being quietly dismantled. Not through lectures or ideological debates, but simply by watching competent people go about ordinary work. Nobody here claimed to possess secret knowledge. Nobody insisted they had discovered the perfect society. In fact, the residents seemed remarkably suspicious of anyone claiming perfection. Whenever I complimented a system, someone immediately pointed out its weaknesses. If I admired the greenhouses, the growers explained the risks posed by fungal disease and pollinator shortages. If I praised the hydro station, Noah would remind me that one poorly timed landslide could still damage the intake. When I congratulated Maggie on the bakery's astonishing organization, she laughed and confessed that she had spent nearly 15 years getting flour storage wrong before finally understanding that mice, moisture, and human optimism formed a particularly dangerous combination. It slowly dawned on me that humility was not merely a personality trait in Haven Valley. It was part of the engineering. Every system had been designed by people who assumed they would eventually be proven wrong about something. Instead of treating that possibility as failure, they prepared for it in advance. That morning, Eleanor met me outside the library carrying 2 notebooks. One she handed to me without explanation, the other she tucked beneath her arm. "You'll want to take notes today," she said. "I've been taking notes every day. Today you'll discover why." She started walking toward the eastern side of town, where a low stone building overlooked the river. Unlike the workshops or the hydro station, there was very little noise here. Even before we reached the entrance, the atmosphere changed. People spoke more softly. Footsteps slowed almost instinctively. Flower boxes sat beneath the windows despite the winter, protected by insulated glass enclosures that allowed small herbs to continue growing through the cold months. The building itself was neither large nor impressive, yet it radiated an unmistakable sense of calm. A carved wooden sign above the entrance read simply, "Community Clinic." I had expected something closer to a well-equipped rural medical center, and in many respects, that expectation proved correct. Examination rooms lined one corridor, while treatment areas, a modest laboratory, diagnostic equipment, and a surprisingly modern surgical suite occupied another. Solar tubes filled the interior with natural light, reducing the sterile feeling common to so many hospitals. What surprised me most, however, was the absence of urgency. Nurses moved briskly, but not frantically. Physicians stopped to chat with patients after appointments. Children played in a reading corner without anyone shushing them. An elderly couple sat drinking tea while waiting for routine examinations, looking more like neighbors visiting friends than patients awaiting medical care. A woman wearing a navy blue sweater rather than a white lab coat greeted us near the reception desk. Her silver hair had been tied back carelessly, and laugh lines framed eyes that somehow managed to appear both intensely observant and deeply reassuring. Eleanor introduced her as Dr. Lila Navarro, who had spent more than 25 years practicing emergency medicine before helping establish Haven Valley's healthcare system. "I expected doctors to wear white coats," I admitted. Lila smiled. "I stopped wearing one years ago." "Why?" "Because patients talk to the coat instead of the person." She led us toward a consultation room while continuing our conversation. Medicine has a remarkable tendency to become intimidating without intending to. The equipment grows larger, the terminology becomes more specialized. Eventually, patients begin assuming their own bodies are mysteries best left entirely to experts. She paused beside a wall displaying detailed anatomical charts drawn by local artists rather than purchased from medical suppliers. "They aren't." Inside her office, shelves overflowed with textbooks, anatomy models, botanical guides, pharmacology references, and binders thick with handwritten notes. Beside a sophisticated ultrasound machine stood several instruments that looked as though they belonged in a 19th-century physician's bag. Lila noticed my curiosity. "We keep both." "The old equipment still works?" She laughed. "The old equipment never stopped working." Over the next 2 hours, she guided me through nearly every aspect of the clinic's operation, and once again I found myself confronting a philosophy rather than merely a collection of procedures. Every advanced medical technology available to Haven Valley was accompanied by training in lower technology alternatives. Ultrasound machines were wonderful, but physicians also practiced physical examination skills relentlessly. Laboratory equipment accelerated diagnosis, yet technicians remained fully capable of performing manual analyses when necessary. Electronic medical records existed, backed up daily, but every patient also possessed a carefully maintained paper file stored in fire-resistant archives. "Redundancy again," I observed. "No," Lila replied gently. "Continuity." She opened a cabinet containing hundreds of neatly labeled binders. "If our computers disappear tomorrow, nobody loses their medical history." Another cabinet held meticulously organized seeds and dried medicinal plants. If commercial pharmaceutical production becomes interrupted, these become valuable. Nearby stood refrigeration units powered by redundant electrical circuits. If the power fails, backup systems engage. Finally, she pointed toward a greenhouse visible through the rear windows. "And if every backup eventually fails?" I followed her gaze. "We begin growing what we can." There was nothing romantic about the conversation. Nobody suggested herbs could replace antibiotics or that traditional medicine somehow eliminated the need for modern science. Quite the opposite. Haven Valley embraced evidence with remarkable enthusiasm, but it also acknowledged something I had rarely heard discussed in modern healthcare planning: the difference between optimal medicine and available medicine. Their goal was not perfection under ideal conditions, it was competence under changing ones. As we continued our tour, Lila introduced me to nurses, pharmacists, laboratory technicians, physiotherapists, and apprentices rotating through various departments. Once again, education seemed inseparable from daily work. Every experienced professional taught constantly, often without interrupting whatever task they happened to be performing. During one examination, a physician quietly explained diagnostic reasoning to 2 students while simultaneously reassuring an anxious patient. In another room, an experienced nurse demonstrated proper wound care techniques while discussing the history of sanitation and public health. I found myself asking Lila a question that had been growing in my mind since arriving. "How many doctors live here?" 6. "And that's enough?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "No." I waited. "It never will be." Seeing my puzzled expression, she continued. "The question isn't whether we have enough doctors. What is the question? How healthy can we help people remain before they need one?" That answer echoed through my thoughts long after we left the examination room. Modern medicine often focused, understandably, on treating illness. Haven Valley invested extraordinary effort preventing it in the first place. Nutrition, exercise, clean water, vaccination, mental health, social connection, good housing, fresh air, safe workplaces, education. Nearly every system I had already visited contributed indirectly to healthcare. Maggie's bakery wasn't simply producing bread, it was reducing malnutrition. Noah's hydro station wasn't merely generating electricity, it kept vaccines refrigerated and water treatment operational. Daniel's machine shop manufactured replacement parts for medical equipment. The school taught children hygiene alongside mathematics. Even the community orchestra, Eleanor later explained, had measurable effects on emotional well-being. Health, I realized, wasn't something produced inside the clinic. The clinic merely protected what the rest of the town had already been building. Near midday, we crossed back through the square toward the library, although calling it a library now seemed increasingly inadequate. The timber building served simultaneously as archive, research center, public meeting hall, classroom, printing workshop, museum, and community living room. During my previous visits, I had admired its shelves and collections. Today, Eleanor intended to show me something different. "The books aren't the important part," she said as we entered. I looked around. I was fairly certain they were. They're only the visible part. We climbed a narrow staircase into an upper gallery where several people sat around large tables copying handwritten manuscripts with extraordinary care. I stopped. They're copying books. They always are. Why? One elderly woman looked up from her work and smiled warmly. Paper ages. Another continued the sentence without looking away from her page. So does ink, a younger man added from the next table. And eventually printers break. Eleanor watched my expression with obvious amusement. We don't preserve information by storing it. She gestured around the room. We preserve it by using it. I wandered slowly between the tables. Some volunteers copied engineering diagrams, others transcribed agricultural manuals, music scores, historical journals, language dictionaries, medical references, or children's stories. Every completed volume received careful inspection before joining the archive. One shelf particularly captured my attention. Instead of technical manuals, it contained novels, poetry, plays, collections of jokes, fairy tales, travel writing, biographies. Interesting priorities, I remarked. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Do you know what survives longest after civilization's collapse? I considered the question. Religious texts? Sometimes. She ran her fingers gently along the shelf. Stories. Why? Because people remember them. That simple observation lingered with me. Technical knowledge explained how civilization functioned. Stories explained why it mattered. Without stories, engineering became maintenance. Without engineering, stories became nostalgia. Perhaps civilization required both equally. Later that afternoon, Eleanor unlocked a door I had never previously noticed beneath the main archive. A narrow staircase descended into a climate-controlled vault extending far beneath the building. Rows of compact shelving disappeared into the distance. Maps, blueprints, photographs, audio recordings, films, letters, diaries, financial records, council minutes, weather observations, population studies, crop yields. Every imaginable fragment of community life carefully catalogued. At the center stood an enormous circular table supporting what appeared to be an intricate family tree. Only it wasn't families, it was teachers. Colored lines connected generations of instructors across dozens of disciplines. Master carpenter to apprentice, apprentice to instructor, instructor to future apprentice. The same pattern repeated through medicine, engineering, agriculture, music, mathematics, chemistry, baking, and dozens of other fields. What am I looking at? I asked quietly. Our continuity map. I leaned closer. It's everyone. Almost. She pointed toward several empty spaces waiting patiently near the outer edge. And eventually you. I looked at her. I'm an accountant. She nodded. Exactly. I laughed. Nobody builds monuments to accountants. Eleanor smiled. No. She rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table. But civilizations quietly disappear without them. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I thought about inventories, budgets, forecasts, maintenance reserves, crop allocations, apprenticeship funding, the bakery, the clinic, the hydro station, the machine shop. Every system depended on honest accounting, not because money itself mattered, but because limited resources demanded truthful decisions. Suddenly, accounting seemed less like bookkeeping and more like cartography. Its purpose wasn't measuring wealth. Its purpose was helping communities navigate reality. As evening approached, the library gradually filled with residents arriving for what Eleanor described simply as Thursday. Apparently every Thursday evening, the community gathered for shared learning. No compulsory attendance, no examinations, no certificates. Anyone could teach. Anyone could attend. That night, one workshop covered blacksmithing fundamentals. Another introduced basic astronomy. Children practiced choral music upstairs. A retired geologist discussed local rock formations. Several teenagers debated constitutional history. In one corner, Maggie demonstrated sourdough fermentation to a group of fascinated newcomers while quietly insisting that yeast possessed a personality no scientist had yet adequately explained. The building buzzed with conversation, questions, laughter, curiosity. Nobody seemed especially concerned about becoming experts. They simply enjoyed becoming slightly less ignorant than yesterday. Walking back toward my room later that evening beneath a sky crowded with winter stars, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. The quiet ark wasn't preparing for civilization to end. It was practicing civilization every single day: the farms, the workshops, the clinic, the school, the library, the music, the accounting, the teaching. None of them were contingency plans waiting for disaster. They were daily habits strengthening the community long before any interruption ever arrived. As I reached the library steps, I glanced back across the softly illuminated valley. Warm light spilled from workshop windows. Somewhere a violin drifted gently through the cold night air. The hydro station continued its steady conversation with the river. A child laughed somewhere in the darkness. And it occurred to me that perhaps humanity had misunderstood resilience all along. Resilience was not the ability to survive extraordinary times. It was the willingness to live ordinary days so well that extraordinary times found you already prepared. By the time my third week began in Haven Valley, I had stopped feeling like a visitor and started noticing the subtle responsibilities that came with belonging, even temporarily, to a functioning community. Maggie no longer asked whether I wanted another loaf of bread. She simply handed me one if she thought I looked like I had skipped lunch. Noah occasionally waved me into the hydro station to help move equipment, not because my contribution materially improved the work, but because carrying heavy objects while discussing turbine bearings had somehow become part of my education. Daniel had discovered that I possessed almost no practical machining ability whatsoever, a fact he found endlessly amusing, though he also insisted that every accountant should know how difficult it actually was to manufacture the parts they casually assigned standard costs to in spreadsheets. Even the children had accepted me, though mostly because they found it entertaining that I could explain compound interest, yet remained spectacularly incompetent at identifying bird calls. Somewhere along the way, the valley had quietly adopted me, and I found that far more disarming than any formal welcome could have been. One crisp Monday morning, Eleanor appeared outside the library carrying neither maps nor notebooks, but a thick ledger bound in dark green leather. She held it with both hands as though it deserved a certain amount of ceremony, although not enough to become theatrical. "Today," she said, "you're finally going to see why I invited you." I looked at the ledger and smiled. "After everything I've seen so far, I assumed you wanted another amateur baker." She laughed. "Absolutely not. Maggie would resign immediately." She handed me the volume. Embossed across its cover were 4 simple words: Community Resource Ledger. It weighed far more than its size suggested. "I've been wondering when we'd discuss money," I admitted as we walked toward a modest stone building adjoining the council hall. "We're not discussing money." I looked at the ledger. "It certainly looks like accounting." "It is. What's the difference?" Eleanor glanced toward me with the expression she often wore immediately before asking questions that permanently rearranged my thinking. "Money," she said, "is only one way of measuring value." Inside the building, I discovered what might have been my favorite room in the entire valley. It was neither grand nor architecturally impressive. Sunlight entered through tall windows overlooking the square. Shelves carried binders instead of books. Large tables supported maps, production schedules, inventory reports, weather forecasts, demographic charts, maintenance plans, and what appeared to be enough sharpened pencils to withstand several centuries of vigorous budgeting. 3 people worked quietly at separate desks while another adjusted colored markers on an enormous planning board that covered one wall. No expensive artwork, no executive offices, no motivational slogans, just information, clear, organized, current information. I felt unexpectedly at home. "This," Eleanor said, "is the resource office." I ran my hand across the ledger. "So, the finance department?" She smiled. "Not exactly." A man in his early 60s rose from one of the desks and walked toward us with a cup of tea balanced precariously atop several folders. His neatly trimmed gray beard and permanently thoughtful expression reminded me of professors I had admired in university. Eleanor introduced him as Samuel Rhodes. "Our economist." Samuel immediately shook his head. No, I'm our observer." He pointed toward the windows overlooking the valley. "The economy is out there." His finger shifted toward the shelves. "I'm merely trying to describe it accurately." That answer alone convinced me I was going to enjoy the day. Samuel invited us to a large oak table where several ledgers lay open beside modern laptops displaying detailed spreadsheets. "We use computers constantly," he explained, noticing my curiosity. "They're magnificent tools." He patted one of the handwritten books. "But paper remains wonderfully patient." The pages revealed production statistics, unlike any financial statements I had encountered during my career. Not dollars, not profits, not quarterly earnings. Instead, each section tracked physical reality: kilograms of wheat harvested, hours of apprentice instruction, water stored, machine availability, medical supplies, lumber seasoning, livestock health, electrical generation, soil fertility, bee colony strength, volunteer hours, musical performances, library circulation, births, deaths, forest regeneration, tool wear, community celebrations. I looked up. "You measure everything." Samuel smiled gently. "We try to notice everything." He paused thoughtfully. "There's an important difference." For the next several hours, he walked me through what he called the Valley's resource accounting system, and I found myself more intellectually excited than I had been in years. Every familiar accounting principle still existed, only expressed through physical rather than purely financial terms. Depreciation tracked not merely equipment value, but remaining useful life based on maintenance history. Inventory wasn't measured solely by quantity, but by replacement difficulty. Assets included healthy forests, fertile soil, experienced teachers, apprentices nearing qualification, community trust, and biodiversity alongside tractors, buildings, and machine tools. At one point, Samuel noticed me staring at a page titled Knowledge Capital. "You've never seen that on a balance sheet?" "No. Perhaps it belongs there." The page listed every critical skill required for the Valley's long-term continuity: electricians, midwives, millwrights, librarians, blacksmiths, hydrologists, teachers, veterinarians, instrument makers, glassworkers, machinists, surveyors. Each category included not merely the number of qualified people, but also their average age, number of apprentices, expected retirements, and estimated years before replacement capacity became inadequate. I looked at Samuel in disbelief. "You forecast retirements by profession?" "We forecast continuity." He folded his hands. "A community can survive losing money." He let that thought settle. It cannot survive losing irreplaceable knowledge. I thought immediately of my former company back in Winnipeg. Our financial statements could predict cash flow to within a few percentage points, yet nobody had ever produced a report estimating how many experienced maintenance technicians would retire over the next decade or whether anyone actually knew how to replace them. We measured the wrong assets because they were easier to count. Samuel interrupted my thoughts. "Would you like to see our most valuable resource?" I assumed it would be the hydro station. No. The farms? No. The clinic? No. He stood and motioned for us to follow. We walked outside toward a modest building behind the school that I had barely noticed during previous tours. Inside, dozens of teenagers and adults worked quietly together around tables covered with notebooks, engineering drawings, musical instruments, electronic circuits, woodworking projects, language exercises, and mechanical assemblies. Nobody seemed to be teaching. Nobody seemed to be studying. Everyone simply learned. "What is this?" "The learning exchange." I frowned. "The school?" Samuel shook his head. "The school educates children." He swept his arm across the room. "This educates civilization." An elderly electrician sat beside a 16-year-old girl explaining transformer design. Across the room, a teenager patiently taught smartphone programming to a retired carpenter. A physician discussed microbiology with several farmers. A machinist received piano lessons from a 12-year-old boy. No hierarchy, no embarrassment, no assumption that expertise traveled only in one direction. "You require everyone to keep learning?" Samuel smiled. "We make it difficult not to." I watched for several minutes as knowledge flowed through the room almost visibly. It resembled an ecosystem more than an institution. Every person both taught and learned. No one remained solely a student. No one remained solely an expert. Finally, I understood why the Valley possessed such extraordinary resilience. Knowledge never became trapped inside individuals. It circulated continuously. That afternoon, Samuel handed me several years of historical resource reports. "I have a question for you." I opened the first binder. "What is it?" "Find our biggest problem." Now this was familiar territory. Whether examining manufacturing companies, bakeries, or non-profit organizations, every system contained constraints. Somewhere, something limited performance. For nearly 2 hours I compared production figures, maintenance records, population trends, apprenticeship pipelines, agricultural yields, energy forecasts, inventory turnover, and demographic projections. Eventually one pattern began emerging. I frowned. "Interesting." Samuel remained silent. "The population is growing." "Yes." "But not quickly." "No." "Food production is increasing faster." "Correct." "Power generation too." "Yes." I continued turning pages. "Healthcare capacity appears adequate." "It is. Education." I stopped. "There it is." Samuel smiled almost imperceptibly. "What do you see?" I tapped several tables. "You don't have enough teachers." "Explain." "The school has enough." "Yes." "But apprenticeship programs are expanding faster than experienced instructors." I looked up. Within 10 years, unless something changes, educational capacity becomes the limiting factor for everything else. Samuel leaned back, obviously pleased. "Exactly." I laughed softly. "Your bottleneck isn't food." "No." "Or energy." "No." "It's teachers." He nodded. "The most difficult infrastructure to build isn't physical." He looked toward the learning exchange visible through the window. "It's human." For the remainder of the afternoon, we discussed possible solutions. Could experienced retirees teach part-time longer? Should apprentices begin mentoring earlier? Would rotating specialists through multiple disciplines create more flexibility? Could recorded lessons supplement practical instruction without replacing it? The conversation felt wonderfully familiar, except instead of maximizing quarterly profits, we were optimizing civilization itself. As the sun settled behind the western mountains, Samuel closed the final ledger. "There's one more thing." He reached into a drawer and removed a small wooden box. Inside rested several ordinary coins: copper, silver, brass, beautifully crafted. "You use currency after all." "We do." He handed me one. One side displayed the river and open book that appeared throughout the valley. The other bore a single word: enough. I turned the coin over in my fingers. "No numbers? No denominations?" "How does it work?" "It doesn't." I looked up, confused. "It reminds us." "Of what?" Samuel smiled. "That every economy eventually has to answer one question." He waited. "When is enough enough?" Walking back toward the library that evening, I carried the small coin in my pocket, rolling it between my fingers while snow began drifting lazily from a sky already fading toward dusk. The conversations of the day kept returning to me, particularly Samuel's distinction between money and value. For 30 years I had measured success through financial statements: revenue growth, gross margins, working capital, cash flow, necessary measurements certainly, useful ones, but incomplete. A profitable company could quietly lose its most experienced engineers. A growing city could gradually destroy its fertile farmland. A wealthy nation could allow practical skills to disappear while celebrating rising asset prices. Every balance sheet revealed some truths while concealing others. The quiet ark had not abandoned accounting. It had expanded it. Instead of asking only, "How much money do we have?" the valley continually asked dozens of additional questions. How much trust? How much knowledge? How much healthy soil? How many competent teachers? How many people capable of repairing tomorrow's machines? How many children curious enough to become tomorrow's engineers? How many musicians reminding everyone that life required more than efficiency? By the time I reached the library steps, I had arrived at a conclusion that would have sounded almost absurd only a month earlier. Perhaps civilization did not ultimately rise or fall because of economics. Perhaps economics simply revealed whether a civilization understood what was truly worth preserving. By the 4th week of my stay in Haven Valley, I had begun to understand something that had puzzled me since the day I arrived. The valley's remarkable competence did not originate in extraordinary intelligence, unusual wealth, or even particularly advanced technology. All of those things certainly helped, but none of them explained why everything seemed to function with such quiet confidence. The real difference, I was beginning to suspect, lay in attention. People here paid attention to one another. They noticed when someone looked tired before exhaustion became illness. They noticed when a machine developed a new vibration before it became a catastrophic failure. They noticed when a child displayed an unusual curiosity about plants or mathematics or music, and instead of dismissing it as a passing interest, they gently introduced that child to someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the subject. Attention, I realized, was a form of maintenance, not just for equipment, but for people. Perhaps that was what civilization really meant. Millions of small acts of careful attention accumulating over generations until they became culture. The discovery arrived unexpectedly during what I assumed would be an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I had spent the morning with Samuel refining several inventory forecasting models, an activity that felt pleasantly familiar after years of financial planning. We'd been discussing seasonal consumption patterns for copper wire when the church bell, or rather, what I still called the church bell despite there being no church attached to it, rang 3 times across the valley. Work did not stop immediately, but within a few minutes people began putting away tools, closing notebooks, covering machinery, and drifting toward the central square. Curious, I looked at Samuel. "What's happening?" He glanced at the clock. "It's Wednesday." I waited. He smiled. "Exactly." Seeing my continued confusion, he laughed. "You'll understand." We walked outside together, where perhaps 200 residents had already gathered in the square. Children sat cross-legged near the front, while older residents occupied benches along the edges. Bakers stood beside blacksmiths, farmers beside nurses, mechanics beside librarians. Nobody seemed particularly dressed for an event. They had simply arrived as they were, carrying the ordinary appearance of people interrupted briefly in the middle of useful work. Near the center of the square stood a small wooden platform no more than a foot high. Upon it rested a single chair. Nothing else. "No speeches?" I asked. "No." "A meeting?" "No." Samuel folded his hands behind his back. "Listen." An elderly woman slowly climbed onto the platform, carrying a weathered violin case. She opened it with the practiced movements of someone who had repeated the ritual thousands of times. Without introduction or applause, she lifted the instrument beneath her chin and began to play. The melody was unfamiliar, simple, gentle. It wandered through the square like sunlight moving across water. Nobody spoke. Children remained astonishingly still. Even the dogs seemed to settle quietly beside their owners. The piece lasted perhaps 6 minutes. When it ended, the woman bowed slightly, climbed down, closed her violin case, and returned to the crowd. People smiled. Several embraced her. Then, almost immediately, everyone returned to work. I stared after them. "That's it?" Samuel nodded. "That's it." What was the occasion? Wednesday. There has to be more. There isn't. I looked around the now empty square. You stopped the entire town. For music. Every week. Every Wednesday. But why? Samuel seemed genuinely surprised by the question, because otherwise we'd eventually stop. I must have looked unconvinced, because he continued. "We're very good at maintaining machines." He gestured toward the workshops. "And buildings. Toward the houses. And crops. Toward the greenhouses. But communities require maintenance too." The simplicity of the answer unsettled me. How many organizations had I worked for that invested millions maintaining equipment while assuming relationships somehow repaired themselves? That afternoon, Eleanor found me sitting outside the library, still thinking about the violin. "You've met Wednesday." "I don't understand Wednesday." She laughed softly. Neither did I at first. She sat beside me on the bench overlooking the square. "The founders noticed something during the early years." "What?" "Everyone became so focused on building the valley that they gradually stopped noticing one another." "Too much work." "Exactly." She watched several children chasing one another across the grass. They were constructing an extraordinary community. She smiled, and forgetting to live in it. So they created a pause. She shrugged. One song every week. That solves the problem? No. She looked at me thoughtfully. But it reminds us to solve the problem ourselves. Over the following days, I began noticing similar patterns everywhere. Nothing dramatic, just deliberate interruptions. Every Friday afternoon, the machine shops closed 30 minutes early so apprentices could present something they had learned that week, whether successful or unsuccessful. Every Sunday evening, residents gathered for storytelling in the library. Every month, the council suspended ordinary business entirely and invited children to ask questions adults couldn't immediately answer. Several afternoons each season were reserved simply for walking through the surrounding forests without objectives beyond paying attention. None of these activities directly produced food, electricity, medicine, or manufactured goods. Yet somehow, they seemed just as essential. Late that week, Daniel invited me back to the machine shop where George, the elderly machinist, stood examining several cracked gears laid across a workbench. Perfect timing, Daniel said. We've got a puzzle. George handed me one of the gears. The fracture looked odd, not catastrophic, almost gradual. What happened? We don't know. I studied the worn teeth. No impact damage. No manufacturing defect that I can see. George nodded. Correct? So? Daniel smiled. We've been discussing possibilities for 3 hours. I looked around. Nearly a dozen people had gathered. Machinists, apprentices, engineers, a metallurgist, even Noah from the hydro station. You've had 12 experts discussing one gear? Daniel shook his head. 12 perspectives. For the next hour, I watched something remarkable unfold. Nobody competed. Nobody tried to appear clever. One apprentice suggested unusual vibration frequencies. A metallurgist proposed microscopic inclusions within the steel. George wondered whether temperature cycling had altered material properties over time. Noah questioned lubrication intervals. Every suggestion received careful consideration. Eventually, a 19-year-old apprentice quietly asked whether anyone had measured shaft alignment after the previous bearing replacement 6 months earlier. Silence. George looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Noah. Noah slowly smiled. Nobody did. An hour later, measurements confirmed the apprentice's theory. Tiny misalignment, almost invisible, enough to create years of uneven loading. The mystery was solved. George walked over to the young apprentice. Well done. The teenager looked almost embarrassed. I just noticed something. George shook his head. No. He rested one hand gently on the apprentice's shoulder. You paid attention. Walking back toward town later, I found myself reflecting on the distinction. Knowledge mattered enormously. Experience mattered too, but perhaps civilization advanced through something even more fundamental. Attention. The willingness to notice reality before assumptions replaced observation. That evening, I visited the library, intending to review several resource forecasts with Samuel. Instead, I found nearly every table occupied. Children practiced chess with retirees. Several nurses learned woodworking from Sophia. Daniel sat listening to a teenager explain a computer simulation involving bridge design. Maggie taught bread baking to 3 physicians who admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that they had managed to burn almost everything during previous attempts. Near the fireplace, Noah struggled heroically to learn the violin from Wednesday's elderly musician. His expression suggested the experience bordered on public humiliation. The woman remained wonderfully patient. After producing a particularly unfortunate sound, Noah sighed dramatically. I think I've accidentally invented a new emergency siren. The room erupted in laughter, including his teacher, especially his teacher. Watching them, I realized something else. Nobody seemed afraid of appearing incompetent. In fact, visible incompetence appeared almost expected whenever someone learned something new. How different that felt from so many professional environments where admitting ignorance carried hidden penalties. Later, I asked Eleanor about it. We celebrate beginners. Why? Because every expert was one. She considered the question for another moment. And because pretending competence slows learning. Another deceptively simple truth. Near sunset, I wandered alone toward the orchards lying dormant beneath winter snow. The bare apple trees stretched across the hillside in orderly rows, their branches patiently awaiting another spring. Several volunteers wrapped young trunks against rabbits while discussing next year's grafting plans. One of them, an elderly horticulturalist named Ben, invited me to help. I confessed complete ignorance. He handed me a roll of protective wrap anyway. Perfect. Perfect? I'd rather teach someone who admits not knowing. For nearly 2 hours we worked together in comfortable conversation. Ben explained how some of the orchard's oldest apple varieties no longer existed commercially. Others resisted diseases without chemical treatment. Still others stored naturally through long winters. Each tree represented decades of accumulated selection. People think orchards produce apples. He carefully secured another protective wrap. They produce time. I smiled. Everything around here eventually becomes time. He laughed. Exactly. A loaf of bread. Time. A spare bearing. Time. A teacher. Lots of time. He looked thoughtfully across the sleeping orchard. A fruit tree. I waited. A promise. That evening, the first significant snowfall since my arrival settled gently across Haven Valley. Lights glowed warmly beneath accumulating drifts while smoke curled upward into perfectly still air. Standing outside the library before turning in for the night, I listened carefully. The hydro station hummed softly beneath the river. Somewhere a hammer struck steel twice before falling silent. Laughter drifted faintly from the community hall. Then, from a house near the square, I heard someone practicing the violin. Not beautifully, not yet. The notes wandered uncertainly, searching for confidence. I smiled immediately. Noah. He was still trying. The sound would probably never appear in any economic report Samuel prepared. No inventory ledger tracked it, no maintenance schedule depended upon it. No engineering manual required it. Yet somehow the valley felt stronger because of those hesitant notes floating through the winter darkness. Back in my room, before extinguishing the lamp, I opened my journal and wrote only a single sentence. A civilization survives because people know how to repair its machines. It becomes worth saving because people also learn how to play the violin on Wednesday afternoons. I closed the journal and listened a little longer as the uncertain melody continued outside, growing almost imperceptibly steadier with every attempt. By the middle of February, winter had settled so completely over Haven Valley that it no longer felt like a season, but a permanent characteristic of the landscape. Snow softened every rooftop, every fence line, every stone wall, and every evergreen until the entire valley seemed carved from light itself. The river continued its patient journey beneath shelves of blue-white ice, revealing only narrow ribbons of dark moving water where the current refused to surrender. The mountains had become silent companions rather than scenery. Every morning they greeted the valley before sunrise with shades of violet and deep blue, and every evening they swallowed the last sunlight long before darkness reached the streets below. I had never before understood why people living in beautiful places often spoke so little about the scenery. After several weeks, the extraordinary gradually became familiar. Beauty, like competence, quietly faded into the background until something reminded you to notice it again. I had also begun to realize that winter itself served an important purpose in the quiet arc. It was not merely something endured while waiting for spring. It was a season for inspection. During summer and autumn, everyone grew, harvested, built, repaired, and stored. Winter invited reflection. Machines were dismantled for maintenance, buildings were carefully inspected, seeds were sorted and tested. Apprentices spent longer hours studying, musicians rehearsed, teachers revised lesson plans, farmers analyzed last year's crop yields, engineers reviewed every unexpected equipment failure from the previous 12 months. Even the council postponed major expansion projects until winter discussions had challenged every optimistic assumption. The valley did not treat winter as empty time. It treated it as thinking time. One morning, Eleanor knocked gently on my door before sunrise, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a folded clipboard. "Today," she said, "you finally get to participate instead of simply observing." I accepted the coffee with obvious enthusiasm. Should I be nervous? She considered the question seriously enough to make me wonder. Only a little. After breakfast, nearly the entire adult population gathered inside the community hall. The atmosphere felt strangely festive despite the stacks of ledgers, maps, charts, and engineering drawings covering the tables. Children occupied the balcony above, watching with the same fascination many children reserve for sporting events, though I suspected balance sheets rarely attracted similar audiences elsewhere in the world. "What exactly is happening?" I whispered. Eleanor smiled. "Annual inventory." "I've spent 30 years doing inventory." She shook her head. "No." She pointed toward the room. "You've counted things." The distinction should have warned me. Samuel stood near the front beside an enormous wall-sized chart divided into dozens of categories: food, water, energy, medicine, shelter, knowledge, education, transportation, forests, livestock, soil, tools, manufacturing, communications, culture, governance, each heading branched into dozens of increasingly detailed measurements. "We're not auditing departments," Samuel announced as the room gradually quieted. "We're auditing continuity." The words settled over the hall with surprising gravity. Groups immediately formed around different tables. Maggie joined the food team. Noah headed toward energy. Lila disappeared into healthcare. Daniel gathered several machinists near manufacturing. To my surprise, Samuel motioned for me to join him. "You'll enjoy this." The accounting team consisted of only 5 people. I had expected 20. Instead, everyone else already understood that accounting belonged to the entire community. Our responsibility wasn't producing numbers. It was making sure they described reality honestly. For the next several hours, I watched information flow into the room from every corner of the valley. Grain storage reports, greenhouse production forecasts, hydroelectric maintenance schedules, timber inventories, apprenticeship completion estimates, medical supply expiration dates, bridge inspection records, bee colony survival rates, wildlife observations, library preservation status, birth statistics, migration trends, volunteer hours, equipment condition reports. Nothing seemed too small. Nothing seemed too large. Everything connected. At first, the process looked chaotic. Gradually, I recognized remarkable order hidden beneath the activity. Nobody defended their department. Nobody inflated accomplishments. When Maggie reported that flour losses had increased slightly because of unexpected humidity, nobody searched for someone to blame. Instead, Daniel immediately offered improved storage racks from the woodworking shop. When Noah reported accelerated wear on one turbine bearing, Samuel quietly adjusted long-term maintenance forecasts. When Lila explained that 2 physicians planned retirement within 7 years, the education team began discussing accelerated medical apprenticeships before the meeting had even moved to the next agenda item. Problems weren't political, they were communal. Around lunchtime, Samuel handed me several reports. "I'd like your opinion." I scanned the pages. Everything appeared healthy. Food reserves exceeded targets. Energy production remained stable. Population growth looked sustainable. Maintenance completion rates actually surpassed expectations. I frowned. "I assume there's something you're worried about." "There is." "What?" He waited. I looked again. Then I noticed it. Library circulation had increased dramatically. Engineering manuals, agricultural texts, medical references. Excellent. But another category had quietly declined over 4 consecutive years: literature, poetry, history, storytelling, music. I looked up. Cultural borrowing. Samuel nodded. "Go on." "People are becoming more interested in practical knowledge." "Yes." "But..." I turned another page. "Less interested in imaginative knowledge." He folded his hands. "What concerns you about that?" The answer arrived almost immediately. "If all anyone studies is survival..." I hesitated. Eventually, nobody remembers why survival matters. Samuel smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He stood and addressed the room. "Before we finish today, Trent has noticed something." Several dozen faces turned toward me. Public speaking had never particularly intimidated me, yet I suddenly felt oddly nervous. Perhaps because this mattered. I stood slowly. "I've only been here a few weeks." Several people nodded encouragingly. "So perhaps I'm misunderstanding the numbers." Samuel shook his head slightly. No disclaimers. Laughter spread gently through the room. I continued. The valley is becoming stronger almost everywhere. Heads nodded again. Our food systems are improving. Maggie smiled. Our engineering capacity continues growing. Daniel folded his arms proudly. Our healthcare planning is excellent. Lila gave a small, appreciative nod. But the room became quieter. I think your success may be creating a different risk. Nobody interrupted. You're becoming so good at preserving civilization. I glanced toward the library reports. That you may gradually forget to preserve imagination. Silence, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. I continued more carefully. The engineering manuals teach us how to build bridges. I looked toward the library balcony where several children listened intently. But novels teach us why people cross them. For several moments no one spoke. Then Maggie quietly raised one hand. My fiction borrowing has dropped. Daniel chuckled. So has mine. Lila sighed. I've been meaning to reread Shakespeare for 3 years. Someone near the back admitted they hadn't attended storytelling night in months. Another confessed replacing evening music practice with additional workshop hours. No accusations, no guilt, just recognition. Finally, Eleanor stood. This, she said softly, is why we conduct winter inventory. She looked around the room. Because shortages don't always happen in warehouses. That sentence remained with me for the rest of the day. Shortages don't always happen in warehouses. Sometimes they happen in attention, or curiosity, or joy, or wonder. By late afternoon, the formal meeting concluded, but rather than returning immediately to work, dozens of people drifted naturally toward the library. I followed. Inside, the atmosphere felt different. Several residents wandered among the fiction shelves almost sheepishly. Children eagerly recommended favorite adventure stories to adults. One machinist borrowed a book of poetry. A physician selected 2 mystery novels. Daniel emerged carrying an illustrated history of medieval cathedrals. I've always meant to read this. Maggie smiled while checking out 3 novels. I'm prescribing myself less productivity. The librarian laughed. Excellent dosage. That evening, without anyone formally organizing it, the great hall filled after supper. Someone lit the fireplace. Ben from the orchards began telling stories about his grandfather homesteading in northern Saskatchewan. A teenager played guitar. Noah, after weeks of determined practice, performed the Wednesday melody on his violin. He still missed several notes. Nobody cared. The applause was thunderous. Even George, who rarely displayed strong emotion, stood to clap. Watching the room, I noticed something remarkable. The conversation sounded different than usual. People laughed more. Ideas wandered. Speculation replaced planning. Children interrupted adults with impossible questions that nobody hurried to answer. A discussion about fruit tree grafting somehow evolved into ancient navigation, which somehow became astronomy, which somehow became whether future settlements might someday exist on Mars. No agenda, no objectives, just curiosity enjoying itself. Later that night, after most people had gone home, Eleanor and I remained beside the dying fire. She poured the last of the tea into 2 mugs. You know, she said quietly, when we first designed Haven Valley, we nearly made a terrible mistake. What was that? We almost optimized everything. I smiled. Sounds efficient. It would have been. She looked thoughtfully toward the empty chairs scattered throughout the hall. And unbearable. I waited. We eventually realized something. What? If every hour serves productivity? She stirred her tea absent-mindedly. Then, eventually, productivity becomes the only thing people know how to serve. Outside, snow continued falling softly beneath the street lamps. The valley lay almost completely silent now, except for the river beneath the ice. I thought about my own life before arriving here. 30 years of quarterly reports, budgets, forecasts, meetings, deadlines. Important work. Necessary work. But how often had I postponed reading a novel because another spreadsheet required attention? How many evenings had disappeared into emails that no one remembered a week later? How many conversations with family had been shortened because I was just finishing something? It occurred to me that perhaps modern life suffered not from a shortage of productivity, but from an abundance of it. We had become astonishingly efficient at producing, less so at appreciating. Before heading upstairs to my room, I wandered once more through the quiet library. Near the entrance stood a small display I hadn't noticed before. A handwritten sign rested above a shelf containing only 6 books. It read, "These books have changed someone's life this year." Beneath the sign, borrowers had quietly written notes. This reminded me to forgive my brother. I decided to become a teacher. Now I finally understand my grandfather. This convinced me to plant fruit trees I'll never see fully grown. After reading this, I started learning the violin. I stood there for several minutes before selecting one of the novels almost at random. As I signed it out, the librarian smiled knowingly. "Inventory?" I returned the smile. "No." I tucked the book beneath my arm. "Investment." By the first week of March, I had lived in Haven Valley long enough that the rhythms of the community had become strangely natural to me. I no longer needed directions to find the machine shop in the early morning or the greenhouse terraces in the afternoon. I knew which table Maggie preferred during supper because the evening sunlight reached it first through the western windows. I had learned that Noah always stopped at the bakery after inspecting the hydro station, claiming he was only there to discuss maintenance with Maggie while somehow leaving with fresh bread every single time. Daniel had reluctantly accepted that my ability to operate a milling machine would probably never advance beyond what he politely described as enthusiastic incompetence, although he had complimented my increasingly accurate inventory forecasts, which I considered fair compensation. Even Wednesday afternoons had become part of my own internal calendar. When the bell rang 3 times across the valley, my mind naturally released whatever problem it had been wrestling with because I knew 6 minutes of music would somehow improve the answer. I had begun arriving at those gatherings believing I was pausing my work. Eventually I realized the opposite was true. The music was part of the work. That Monday morning began so ordinarily that, in retrospect, I almost laughed at how invisible history can be while it is still deciding whether it wishes to become history. Snowmelt had begun creeping across the south-facing slopes, exposing patches of dark earth beneath the orchards, while the river carried slightly more water each day. The first geese had returned, circling overhead before settling briefly near the reservoir as though inspecting whether the valley remained worthy of another spring. Inside the resource office, Samuel and I were reviewing projected timber harvests for the coming year while debating whether a proposed footbridge should be constructed this summer or postponed until the following season. It was the sort of discussion I had come to love because nobody argued from ego. Everyone argued from evidence, and changing one's mind after hearing a better idea was considered evidence of maturity rather than weakness. The interruption began with silence. At precisely 10:17 in the morning, every computer screen in the resource office froze simultaneously. Nobody reacted immediately. Software occasionally misbehaved. Networks occasionally required restarting. Samuel calmly reached for his keyboard. Nothing. The cursor refused to move. Across the hall, someone attempted printing a report. Nothing emerged. A few moments later, the desk telephone produced no dial tone. Still nobody panicked. Then the lights flickered once, twice, recovered, flickered again. Outside, I heard the distinctive sound of the hydro station's emergency alarm, not loud enough to signal catastrophe, but different enough that everyone immediately looked toward the windows. Samuel closed his laptop. "Well?" His voice remained remarkably calm. "It appears reality has arrived." Within less than 2 minutes, the community transformed. Not chaotically, deliberately. People didn't run. They moved. Every resident seemed to know precisely where they belonged. Children quietly followed teachers toward the school. Clinic staff confirmed backup power. Workshop supervisors secured machinery. The bakery continued baking because bread already in the ovens did not particularly care about electrical anomalies. Someone rang the square bell twice. Not an alarm, a gathering signal. Eleanor appeared at the doorway, still buttoning her winter coat. "River." Samuel nodded once. "I'll handle records." He turned toward me. "You're with Eleanor." We reached the hydro station in less than 5 minutes. Noah already stood inside the turbine hall, surrounded by several engineers. One generator had automatically disconnected from the electrical system. The second remained operational but unstable. Digital monitoring displays had gone completely blank. Instead, older analog gauges continued functioning exactly as designed. Noah looked up as we entered. Interesting morning. What happened? He pointed toward the control panels. I don't know yet. Equipment failure? Maybe. He shrugged. Maybe not. He immediately began assigning tasks. Manual flow verification. 2 apprentices nodded. Mechanical governor inspection. Another team departed. Voltage measurements using independent equipment. Done. Nobody waited for instructions beyond their area. Nobody argued. Nobody blamed. The room simply became intensely focused. Watching them, I suddenly appreciated why Daniel had insisted every apprentice understand older machinery. Modern diagnostics had disappeared. Knowledge had not. While Noah coordinated technical inspections, Eleanor quietly observed rather than interfering. Finally, I asked, "Shouldn't we be helping?" "We are. We're just standing here." "No." She looked toward Noah. "We're staying out of the way." Another lesson. Sometimes leadership meant creating space for expertise rather than occupying it. Within 20 minutes, preliminary information began arriving. The turbines themselves appeared healthy. Bearings normal, water flow normal, mechanical systems normal. The problem lay elsewhere. Noah frowned thoughtfully. The electronics? What about them? They all failed simultaneously. Lightning? No storms? Manufacturing defect? Across multiple systems? He shook his head. Unlikely. An apprentice hurried in carrying a portable radio. No external communications. Nothing? We're receiving static. Telephone lines, internet, satellite links. Nothing. Samuel arrived carrying several paper maps beneath one arm. Same reports from the clinic. Lila entered moments later. Medical equipment operating on local power. She paused. No outside contact. The room grew noticeably quieter. Not frightened. Thinking. Eleanor finally spoke. So, everyone looked toward her. It isn't just us. Noah nodded slowly. I don't think it is. For perhaps 30 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Eleanor smiled, actually smiled. Very well. She looked around the room. Let's continue. I stared at her. That's it? She turned toward me. What else would you suggest? I don't know. Exactly. She placed one hand gently on the old backup generator resting nearby. We built this place assuming interruptions happen. She looked toward the river flowing steadily outside. The interruption appears to have arrived. By noon, every major department had reported status. Food production unaffected. Water systems normal. Hydroelectric generation operating manually at reduced capacity. Clinic fully functional. Workshops operational, though relying more heavily on manual equipment. Communications limited entirely to local radio. No information whatsoever from the outside world. The council assembled briefly inside the library. No dramatic speeches, no emergency declarations. Instead, Samuel opened the continuity ledger. Page 1. Protocol A. Extended external communications failure. I looked at Eleanor. You wrote procedures for this? She smiled faintly. We wrote procedures for everything we could imagine. And if something happens that you didn't imagine, she tapped the binder. Then we start writing. The afternoon became one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. Not because anything spectacular occurred, quite the opposite. The valley continued functioning. Children attended school. Maggie baked bread. Daniel repaired equipment. Lila treated patients. Wednesday's violinist, despite it being only Monday, practiced in the community hall because she had promised several beginners another lesson. Life continued, slightly slower, slightly quieter. Entirely recognizable. Walking through the streets, I realized why the founders had resisted designing Haven Valley around constant emergencies. Communities built upon fear eventually require fear to justify themselves. The quiet arc had been built around ordinary life, therefore ordinary life continued. Late that afternoon, Noah invited me back to the hydro station. The older backup generator stood running smoothly now, synchronized with the primary turbine to reduce strain on the damaged control electronics. He handed me a clipboard. I need another pair of eyes. I spent the next hour recording temperatures, pressures, vibration readings, and fuel inventories while Noah adjusted mechanical governors by hand. The work felt strangely satisfying. Real, no dashboards, no automated alerts, just observation, measurement, judgment. At one point I looked toward the old generator humming steadily beside us. I understand now. What? Why you kept this? He smiled without looking up. I hoped someone eventually would. As evening approached, people gathered in the square voluntarily. No announcement had requested it, no attendance required. Residents simply wanted to share information. Samuel summarized the day's findings. No confirmed cause, no outside communication. Sufficient food reserves, stable power, normal medical status. Tomorrow several teams would hike toward neighboring valleys carrying portable radios in hopes of establishing contact. Questions followed. Calm questions. Practical questions. Would schools continue? Yes. Would planting schedules change? Not yet. Should fuel be conserved? Moderately. Should people worry? Samuel answered that one himself. Worry if it helps you prepare. He smiled gently. Otherwise, help your neighbor instead. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The tension eased. Just before everyone dispersed, Wednesday's violinist quietly stepped onto the small platform. Someone whispered, "But it's Monday." She nodded. "I know." Without another word, she began playing. The familiar melody drifted across the valley exactly as it always had. Simple, gentle, steady. When she finished, nobody applauded immediately. Instead, the silence that followed somehow became part of the music itself. Eventually, people smiled at one another and returned home. Walking back toward the library beside Eleanor, I found myself strangely emotional. I thought the test would be dramatic. She looked at me. It is. No explosions. No panic. No collapse. She shook her head. Most interruptions don't announce themselves with fireworks. We stopped near the bridge overlooking the river. Water continued flowing beneath broken sheets of ice exactly as it had yesterday. Exactly as it probably would tomorrow. Eleanor rested both hands on the wooden railing. When we first began building Haven Valley, she said quietly, people assumed we expected some single apocalyptic event. She smiled sadly. They misunderstood. What were you expecting? She watched the current for several moments before answering. Accumulation. I waited. One communication failure. She held up one finger. One supply disruption. Another finger. One software problem. Another. One financial crisis. Another. One severe storm. She looked toward the lights beginning to appear throughout the valley. None of them civilization ending. Her voice softened. But enough of them. She let the sentence remain unfinished. It didn't need completing. Because I suddenly understood. Civilization rarely collapsed because one thing failed. It weakened because many small things failed simultaneously. The quiet ark had never been preparing for the end of the world. It had been preparing for an ordinary Tuesday when enough small interruptions arrived together that the outside world temporarily forgot how connected everything really was. Standing there beside the river, listening to water moving patiently beneath the ice, I found myself thinking back to the envelope Eleanor had mailed weeks earlier. We are not preparing for the end of the world. No. She never had been. She had been preparing for today. The first confirmed message from the outside world reached Haven Valley 9 days after the interruption began. By then, the extraordinary had already started acquiring the quiet routines that all human beings eventually construct around uncertainty. Manual radio watches operated 24 hours a day from the communications room above the library. Every evening, Samuel updated the continuity ledger with whatever new information the community had gathered, even when the day's entry consisted only of the words, "No significant change." Children continued attending school, though geography lessons now included practical exercises in map reading without satellite navigation. Maggie's bakery still filled the valley with the comforting smell of fresh bread every morning, and Noah had stabilized the hydro station by permanently integrating the older generator into the system until replacement electronics could eventually be designed or acquired. Daniel's machine shop had become busier than ever, manufacturing components that previously would have been ordered from suppliers hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The clinic continued treating broken bones, winter illnesses, births, and ordinary life with the same calm professionalism as before. If someone had arrived without knowing anything about the interruption, they might have mistaken the valley for an unusually peaceful small town enjoying a particularly long winter. The radio message itself was almost disappointingly ordinary. A settlement nearly 200 kilometers away had established limited long-range communications using older analog equipment. Digital infrastructure throughout much of the continent remained unreliable following what engineers increasingly believed had been a cascading failure involving several interconnected communications and control networks. Nobody yet understood the precise technical cause. Some regions retained power but had lost financial systems. Others maintained internet connectivity while struggling with transportation logistics. Manufacturing delays rippled unpredictably through supply chains that had previously depended upon astonishing precision. Rail networks operated at reduced capacity. Several major ports reported extended disruptions. None of it resembled apocalypse. It resembled inconvenience, large-scale, persistent, expensive inconvenience. Exactly as Eleanor had predicted. Within days, additional reports painted a picture that felt simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. Governments still functioned. Hospitals remained open. Cities continued existing. Stores had not been abandoned. Civilization had not collapsed. But everywhere, people had begun discovering which systems possessed hidden redundancy and which had quietly assumed uninterrupted perfection. Replacement parts took longer. Specialized medicines occasionally became unavailable. Payment networks operated intermittently. Deliveries arrived weeks behind schedule. Manufacturers lacking critical components slowed production. Farmers struggled obtaining equipment repairs during planting season. Nothing individually catastrophic, collectively exhausting. One evening, after reading the latest reports together in the resource office, I leaned back in my chair and sighed. So you were right. Samuel looked almost disappointed. I hope not. What do you mean? I would much rather have spent 30 years preparing for something unnecessary. He folded the newest communication carefully before placing it into the archive. Success in our work looks remarkably similar to unnecessary caution. I smiled. Like insurance. Exactly. The interruption continued through spring. Gradually, communications improved. Transportation recovered unevenly. Manufacturing adapted. Communities improvised. The world did what human societies have always done after unexpected disruption. It learned. Several neighboring towns contacted Haven Valley requesting assistance. Not food, not fuel, knowledge. Could Noah explain small-scale hydroelectric systems? Would Daniel share machine shop layouts? Could Maggie help establish community bakeries using locally available grain? Would Lila advise rural clinics on maintaining medical services during supply interruptions? Could Samuel provide copies of the Valley's resource accounting methods? Could Eleanor simply visit? For weeks, delegations arrived almost continuously. Engineers, mayors, or teachers, doctors, farmers, librarians, mechanics. They expected secret technologies. Instead, they found notebooks, conversations, coffee, patient explanations, and an astonishing number of handwritten checklists. One afternoon, I watched Daniel explaining preventive maintenance schedules to visitors from a manufacturing cooperative 3 provinces away. They seemed almost embarrassed. We always intended to improve maintenance. Daniel smiled kindly. So did everyone. He tapped one of the inspection sheets. The trick isn't intending. It's scheduling. Nearby, Maggie patiently demonstrated sourdough fermentation to several commercial bakers who admitted that most of their facilities had become completely dependent on industrial yeast deliveries. She handed one visitor a small jar. Take care of it. The woman accepted it carefully. It's alive? So are we. The woman laughed. I hadn't thought about bread that way. Maggie winked. Most people don't. The valley itself changed too. Not dramatically. Gradually. The interruption confirmed something the founders had quietly suspected for decades. Their greatest contribution would never be remaining isolated. It would be remaining connected. Additional apprentices arrived. The library expanded its copying program. The Learning Exchange added new classrooms. The machine shops began producing standardized equipment specifically designed for other communities to manufacture locally. The Quiet Ark stopped being a backup civilization. It became part of a network. One warm afternoon in late May, nearly 6 months after my arrival, Eleanor asked me to accompany her on a walk above the reservoir. Spring had transformed the valley almost overnight. Apple blossoms covered the orchards in clouds of white and pale pink. Children skipped stones along the river where only weeks earlier ice had stretched from bank to bank. The greenhouses overflowed with seedlings preparing for transplantation into surrounding fields. Everywhere life seemed to accelerate. We climbed slowly toward the overlook where I had first seen Haven Valley. Neither of us spoke very much. There seemed little need. Eventually, we reached the ridge. The entire settlement spread beneath us exactly as it had that first afternoon. Yet somehow it appeared different. Not because the buildings had changed, because I had. Eleanor rested comfortably against the weathered fence overlooking the valley. So, I smiled. So, what do you think now? I looked across the workshops, the library, the school, the clinic, the hydro station, the bakery, the orchards, the river. I searched for the right words. I misunderstood accounting. She laughed softly. Go on. For most of my career, I believed accounting measured business. I looked toward the resource office where Samuel undoubtedly organized another impossible number of ledgers. But accounting doesn't measure business. What does it measure? It measures promises. She turned toward me with genuine curiosity. I continued. If we record inventory honestly, we're promising future workers that the supplies they need will actually be there. I pointed toward the workshops. If we budget maintenance correctly, we're promising future mechanics they won't inherit broken equipment. Toward the school. If we invest in teachers, we're promising children opportunities we ourselves may never see. Toward the orchards. If we plant trees. I smiled. We're making promises we'll probably never personally collect. For several moments, Eleanor remained silent. Finally, she nodded. I think Samuel will enjoy that. We sat together on the ridge until the afternoon sun drifted lower across the valley. Eventually, Eleanor spoke again. Do you know why we called it the continuity ledger? I shook my head. I always assumed it sounded appropriately accountant-like. She laughed. It does. Then her expression grew thoughtful. The original founders argued about the name for nearly 3 weeks. What were the alternatives? Emergency manual. I laughed immediately. Terrible. Survival protocol. Worse. Resilience framework. I groaned. Consultants? Several. We both laughed. Then she grew quiet. One evening, an elderly librarian ended the argument. What did she say? Eleanor looked toward the library below. She said ledgers aren't books about the past. I waited. They're conversations with the future. The wind moved gently through the pine trees around us. Far below, the faint sound of children's laughter drifted upward from the schoolyard. I found myself thinking about every person I had met since arriving. Maggie, Noah, Daniel, Lila, Samuel, George, Ben, the violinist. None of them imagined themselves heroes. None expected statues. None believed they were saving civilization. They simply repaired pumps, baked bread, copied books, taught apprentices, maintained turbines, planted orchards, balanced inventories, played music on Wednesday afternoons. Perhaps civilization had always depended upon such people. Not famous leaders, not brilliant visionaries, not extraordinary geniuses. Ordinary professionals who quietly accepted responsibility for things that would outlive them. Several weeks later, after the world had begun finding its balance again, I stood inside the library packing the suitcase I had first carried into Haven Valley months earlier. My old office in Winnipeg had patiently survived my absence. Prairie Meridian components wanted me back. Friends assumed I would return to normal life. I looked around the small room, the wool blanket, the bookshelf, the desk where I had filled an entire journal. Everything looked exactly as it had on my first night, except nothing felt the same. A knock sounded gently at the door. Samuel entered carrying the familiar green leather volume, the Community Resource Ledger. "I believe this belongs to you now." I stared at him. "It certainly doesn't." "It does." He placed it on the desk. "We've prepared a new copy." I opened the cover. Inside the front page, written neatly beneath the title, appeared a single new sentence. "Custodian, Trent Clapperton." I looked up. "I can't take your ledger." Samuel smiled. "You're not." He gently closed the cover. "You're starting another one." Several months later, sitting once again in an office overlooking a manufacturing plant in Winnipeg, I found myself watching forklifts crossing the yard while spring rain tapped softly against the windows. Very little had changed. Invoices still arrived. Suppliers still negotiated prices. Machines still required maintenance. Quarterly forecasts still demanded attention. Life had resumed, yet everything had changed. The first project I proposed involved expanding apprenticeship programs. The second redesigned preventive maintenance schedules. The third documented critical knowledge held by employees approaching retirement. We simplified inventories, standardized components, strengthened local suppliers, started a weekly lunch where experienced tradespeople simply explained how things worked. Every Wednesday afternoon, regardless of meetings or deadlines, I ended work 10 minutes early. At first, people assumed I had another appointment. Eventually, several employees simply gathered in the lunchroom. Someone brought a guitar. Another read poetry. One machinist discovered he played excellent piano. Nobody quite knew why we kept doing it. Only that work somehow improved afterward. Years later, when people occasionally asked where I had learned to think that way, I usually smiled and answered truthfully. From accountants. They almost always laughed. Then I laughed too, because they imagined I was joking. They had never visited a quiet valley in the mountains where a library stood beside a river, where bread was treated as infrastructure, where machine shops built tomorrow, one apprentice at a time, where stories were considered as necessary as spare bearings, where a violin interrupted work every Wednesday afternoon, and where an old green ledger patiently reminded everyone that civilization was never something inherited permanently. It was something balanced, one honest entry at a time,